I used to live in this old apartment when I was younger. It was really an old house that was converted into a duplex, I guess. I had a kitchen, living room, bedroom, and bathroom. Then there was a staircase going down to a very small entryway and the door. The other side, I guess, had basically the same thing, but I didn't know who lived there or anything. So I lived in this apartment for several months. It was cheap and pretty close to my work. Other than that, it was nothing special. I never knew anything strange to happen over the course of the first month that I lived there. I pretty much would be at work a lot, but when I was home I never had any problems. But then there were a few nights where I realized I was waking up in the middle of the night. I just know that I woke up and then went back to sleep pretty much right away one time. Then, another time, I woke up to what I thought was a noise, but I didn't hear anything more after waking up. I remember sitting up in bed and listening closely, but did not hear anything at all. So eventually, I just went back to sleep. This was strange because I normally slept really well and never woke up in the night. These were situations that I didn't even necessarily remember during the next day. But then when I woke up in the middle of the night for a third time in about a week, I was sure I heard a noise and I found it really strange. Once more, I sat up and listened, but I didn't hear any more noises. I couldn't figure out if I was dreaming the noise or if it happened when I was awake. It just seemed pretty strange. But after a while of nothing again, I finally fell back asleep. I wasn't really sure what was going on or what was the cause of me waking up. But then, one of the very next nights, I remember that I woke up again. I don't really remember hearing any noises, but I also was like wide awake immediately after waking up, which was weird. I didn't sit up, but rolled over to my other side. I was looking in the rest of the room, which was completely dark, but I then heard a small creaking sound. It was as if my bedroom door was being opened slowly. I looked over and saw that it was. Then I saw somebody suddenly enter the room from the doorway. It was a man, but I couldn't make out any details. The guy took a step into the room, but did not advance any farther. I was literally too scared to move. It was so dark that I'm not sure if he knew I was awake or not. The man then took out some sort of camera and took a picture of me. Then he disappeared back behind the doorway, going into the hall. I honestly couldn't believe it. I didn't know what on earth was happening. Then I heard some creaking from the floor in the hallway, and I heard a noise like a door being opened and closed. It was quiet but noticeable. After that, everything went completely silent again. I sat in bed without hearing anything for probably the next 10 or 20 minutes. I wasn't sure if I was being robbed or what, but I hadn't heard any noises in a long time. I finally got up and walked around my bedroom. There still was no other sounds, and then I left and went out into the hallway. I turned on a light and did not see or hear anything. Then I went around every room slowly and looked around. My place really wasn't that big, so it didn't take me long to realize that the other person was gone. But when I got to the end of the hallway upstairs, past my bedroom and across from a closet, I realized what must have happened. There was a door leading to my next door neighbors. However, this door I was told was not in use and was always locked. It even had a small table with a lamp on it in front of it, and the door was painted the same color as the wall, so it wasn't really that noticeable. But I knew that had to be where the person had gone. For some reason, the door must not be locked on the other side. After that, I couldn't sleep. I stayed up the rest of the night. In the morning, as soon as I was able to, I contacted the management for my place. I reported what was happening, and I started looking for another apartment immediately. The next few nights, I stayed at a friend's. Long story short, there was a man who lived next door, and he was caught. I'm happy that he never got in my place again after that. The times I had been waking up must have been when he left to go back to his place, possibly when he was closing the door. I will never forget seeing him in my room. It was the creepiest situation that's ever happened to me. I live in what I would describe as a pretty standard apartment. The last one I lived in 2 years ago was very similar as well. The building had a few basic hallways and tons of units. I had a parking space in the underground garage, and there were several apartment buildings in the complex. It was like right in the middle of my lease when I had been living there for about 6 months when some weird things happened. My apartment was on the second floor of the building, kind of towards the end of a hallway. One night, I was awoken to the sound of banging on my door. This happened to be a Friday night at about 3 o'clock in the morning. Somebody was repeatedly banging on my door, and it seemed about as loud as they could. I just laid there in bed and waited for it to stop. But after it continued for about 10 seconds straight, I decided to get up. However, once I had made it out of my bedroom, the knocking finally stopped. I could hear somebody walking away down the hallway then. I went to the peephole and I looked out, but the person was gone. I didn't really want to open the door and look out into the hallway, so I didn't. I just went back to bed and didn't hear any more knocks. The next day, I was thinking about it, remembering being woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning. I figured at that point it was probably somebody who was coming home drunk from the bars or something. It made perfect sense, because it had been a Friday night, and they probably got back and just started banging on a random door, either just to mess with somebody or because they accidentally went to the wrong place. So I really wasn't that concerned about it. However, at some time the next week, it happened again. Once more, I woke up to someone pounding on my front door. I had a bad feeling about it, not knowing who this was. I didn't really know any of my neighbors. I wasn't sure if it was one of them or somebody else that was random. This time, I did not get up. I just waited for the knocking to end, which took maybe 10 or 20 seconds roughly. When it finally ended, I stayed up for almost another hour because I really wasn't that tired anymore. I was finally able to get back to sleep a while later, but this was pretty annoying. Several nights went by before it happened again. This time, it was a little earlier though. I was still awake and in my living room watching TV. All of a sudden, there was a knock at the door. It seemed normal at first, but then it turned into a loud bang. I was so confused. I really didn't want to get up, and I stayed on my couch. The knocking on the door lasted for the usual 15 seconds or so, and then it stopped. This time, I once more heard the person walking away, and the rest of the night, I didn't hear anything more. Nothing strange happened for a few weeks after that. I had almost forgotten about the whole ordeal, but then randomly, it happened again. This time, once more, I was already awake and in the living room. It was pretty late though, and was after midnight. As I sat on the couch in my living room, I heard this loud pounding on my front door. It was crazy just how hard this person was banging on it. I stayed where I was like usual. This time, it seemed to last a little bit longer though, like maybe around 30 seconds. Then I decided to get up and look. I walked over to the door, and it was like the person heard me. When I got within a couple of feet of the door, the knocking stopped, and I heard them walking away. I looked through my peephole and saw no one. This time, I opened up the door and looked out into the hallway. When I did, I actually saw someone. There appeared to be a man walking away, but I only saw his back. He did not turn around and look at me or anything. The man was walking quickly, and I only saw him for maybe 5 seconds. Then he reached the door that led to the stairs and opened it, and then he was gone. I went back inside after that. For the entire rest of the time that I lived in my apartment, I never heard any more knocking. I don't know who that guy was. I didn't recognize him. Why he chose to always knock on my door, I also don't know. It really gave me the creeps though. This is a bizarre experience I had a couple of years ago. During this particular time, I was looking for a new apartment. I'd been living with a roommate in this really run-down, beat-up old place. I had recently got a new job, and finally had a little money to get a place all to myself, and a place that would be nicer as well. The kind of apartment I wanted did not have to be perfect, but I certainly wanted something better than I currently had. This would only be my second apartment that I ever got, and the first by myself. I was excited about it, and looked online for the new place. I was still pretty new to living in this general area, and had moved there from another state when I got my apartment with the roommate. So I went onto an apartment search website, put in my budget and preferences, and looked through the results. After looking at some apartments online, I selected one that I wanted to take a tour of. It seemed like a really good deal, and looked decent from the pictures, so I contacted the management for a tour. I filled out some forms, and then was ready to look at the place a couple of days later. When the time came for the tour, I drove to the apartment complex, which was maybe 10 minutes away. However, after entering the complex, I was unimpressed, and I realized that I may have made a mistake even by selecting to have a tour. I had pretty much already made up my mind that I didn't want to move here. Overall, the place really didn't look any nicer than where I currently lived. The pictures online were real, but they sure made the place look a lot better. Still, I got out of my car and met the tour guide, which happened to be the property manager and landlord. I think he really did just about everything. We met, and he said that he would give me a tour of the unit because the people had just moved out. So I went inside with him, and the apartment building smelled old and musty. Inside the place, the carpet was old and beat up, and there was a spider web with a spider in it in one of the cupboards. The guy was talking really good about the place, as if it was super nice. He mentioned that he lived in the unit next door, and we would be neighbors. I was nice and stayed there for the whole tour. When it was over, the guy asked me if I would take the apartment. I said that I had to look at others first, but would let him know if I wanted it. He did the old salesman technique, saying that he had a bunch of other people interested in the unit, and he even said that he had it on hold from them so that I could tour the place. I didn't know if that was true or not, but I knew he was trying to pressure me. He said he had rearranged things so that I could take the tour, so he hoped that I would take the place. I told him that I could not agree to it right now, and if he had to give the apartment to somebody else, so be it, but I had to look at some other ones. The guy seemed disappointed, but then we said our goodbyes and I left. So after this, I knew I wasn't going to move there, and I went home and continued my search. I decided to raise my budget and realized that I could actually afford something a lot nicer than that dump. The next day, I received a call from the landlord of the apartment I had just looked at. I answered, and he asked me if I was going to take the place. I told him that I decided I was not going to be taking it and would look elsewhere. The man sounded very upset. He said that he had it on hold for me and claimed that he lost other renters because of it. I told him I didn't know that, but I never made a promise that I was going to move there, and I wasn't going to do it. After that, the man continued talking and said that he could possibly lower the rent for me. I still said I wasn't interested. I honestly had no desire to live there, even if it was free, especially knowing that this guy would be my next door neighbor if I did. The guy asked me why I didn't want to move in. I found it strange that he was still talking to me about this. I didn't want to talk to the guy anymore, so I told him that I was just going to look in another area, and then I said bye and hung up. The whole thing was very strange. It was pretty unprofessional, to be honest, but it would get more unprofessional. So that evening, the guy called me again. I don't remember the exact time, but I think it was around 7 p.m. or so. It was really strange. I couldn't imagine what he could possibly want. I didn't answer it, and when the ringing ended, he did not leave a message or anything. The next morning, when I woke up, I noticed that my phone had actually been called another time. He had called in the middle of the night at like 2 a.m. I was hoping that this was just an accident, but this time he did leave a message. When I played it, he simply said that he was trying to get a hold of me and to call him back. I didn't want to, so I blocked his number. I thought that was the end of it, and I would never see him again or hear from him again. That story is strange enough as it is. But a couple of nights later, I was at home with my roommate. I was in my room, and it was sometime at night, maybe 8 or 9 o'clock, and then there was a knock at the door. I didn't know who it could be, but I was possibly expecting somebody to be there to see my roommate. I knew that I wasn't expecting anyone, so I stayed where I was. But a few moments later, my roommate came to my doorway and asked if I invited a guy over. I said no, and she said that some guy was at the front door. At first, I really had no idea who it could be, so I walked over to the door and looked through. The same guy was standing there. It was the landlord from the other apartment building. I had no idea what he could possibly want. As I was standing there, he knocked again. I shouted from the other side, asking what he wanted. He asked if he could come inside, and I said no. He then said that he would only come inside for a minute. I said that if he didn't leave now, I was going to call the police. The man finally cursed at me, kicked at the door, and then stormed off. And after that, he luckily did not come back. I still don't know why that guy kept bothering me. I figured that he got my address on the forms that I had to fill out to look at his apartment. I wish that I never looked at that place at all. I ended up getting a much nicer place a short time later, and have been living there since. This happened back sometime in the very early 2000s. During this time, I was living alone in a one-bedroom apartment that I had recently moved into. I was aware of a few of my neighbors, but not many of them. The building seemed to have people moving in and out quite often. It was a larger apartment building that had a giant parking lot next to it where all the residents parked. The apartment itself was pretty old, and not the nicest, but it was alright. So after a few months of living there, I remembered that one night I heard this sort of pounding noise coming from the next apartment over. I wasn't sure what it was. I knew that it was my next door neighbor though. The noise went on and off as it got later and later. Soon I was trying to go to sleep, but the sounds kept going. I had a hard time falling asleep because of it, and eventually I couldn't take it anymore and I had to go over there. I really didn't want to, but I was left no choice. So I walked over and then knocked on the door. After a few moments, a man opened the door. He was a large man that was bald and wore baggy clothes. He looked at me confused and slightly annoyed. I told him that I was trying to sleep and I was hearing him do something. I asked him if he was hanging stuff on the walls or something like that. The man said no, he was building a table. I guess that made sense, but I asked if he could quiet down because I could not sleep. The guy looked really annoyed, but said okay, and then shut the door in my face. I felt really awkward after, but it was almost midnight, so I went back, and the man did stop, and I was finally able to get some sleep. The next I saw of the guy was actually the very next day though. It was nighttime once again. Now I was about to go to sleep. Out of nowhere, I heard this really loud music coming from next door. It was the same guy's apartment. I rolled my eyes when I heard it. I just hoped that it wouldn't last for very long. The walls in this apartment were pretty thin, so noise traveled, but still, this music had to be almost full blast, and it continued until past when I wanted to go to sleep. I didn't want to go over to his place for a second night in a row. I wondered if this was his way of getting back at me or something. I mean, he knew that he was being loud. So I tried my best to sleep. I didn't have any earplugs, but I tried covering my ears and stuff, but I just couldn't. After trying to fall asleep for over an hour and the music still continuing, I realized that I had to go confront the man. So I left my apartment and I walked on over. After knocking on his door, he did not answer. I waited there for maybe 2 or 3 minutes, knocking several more times. Soon it was clear though that the guy was not going to answer me. So then I headed back to my place. I went back inside, hoping maybe the guy would eventually turn it off, or I could get some rest anyways. Just after making it back to my place though, I thought I heard a door open and close from the hallway. Then, moments later, I heard somebody trying to open my apartment door. Luckily, I had locked it right away when I got back in, which was a habit. This seemed strange, so I went over to check. The man was standing right there. I did not want to open the door because I had a bad feeling. He remained there for a few moments, just standing there and looking angry. Then he turned around and walked back to his place, with the loud music still playing. He did not turn it off. I don't even know when I fell asleep, but when I woke up the next morning, the music had been stopped at some point. After that, I reported the guy to the apartment, but I guess he moved out a very short time later. It was good because I didn't have to deal with him anymore. That was the craziest memory of living in an apartment. My last apartment that I lived in was located in what was a pretty nice area. It was fairly close to the city, and it was nearby many businesses and parks. I enjoyed living there, and my apartment was on the first floor of one of 3 buildings in the complex. My apartment had 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a living room, kitchen area, and a small dining room area. There was also a balcony that was good sized, and it was slightly elevated from the ground below. And behind that, there was a large woods that I had a view of. So one night, I was at home by myself. It was about 9 o'clock, and I was in my living room. That's when I heard some noises coming from outside. I first assumed them to be some neighbors who might have been outside, probably the ones next door. But the noises sounded really close. I was just curious, so I decided to get up and look out of my balcony window. My blinds were closed, so I couldn't see anything outside at all at the moment. When I slid them open, I suddenly saw there was a man standing on my balcony. I couldn't believe it, and instantly my heart started racing. The guy moved out of sight by going to the left. He was still on my balcony, but now out of view from my window mostly. I had no idea who he was, or why he was on my balcony. I moved away from the window, but kept watching to see what the man would do. He seemed to be staying right where he was for quite a while. After like a minute or two, finally I heard some more noise. I then saw him moving away and leaving my balcony. He jumped down onto the ground and then ran off, disappearing into the woods. When that happened, I was really glad that the man was gone, but I also didn't know what he had been doing out there. I went out to the balcony where I didn't really have many things at all. I just had a few decorations here and there that are typical for balconies. Nothing was out of place, and I looked around towards the woods but couldn't see anything strange. So I went back inside and was sure to lock the door and close the blinds again and hope that the man would not return. But he did. It was later that night, maybe 2 hours later. I was about to go to bed when I heard a knocking on the window of my sliding glass door to the balcony. I had a terrible feeling and knew that the man was likely back. There was silence for a while, and then a much louder knock on the door. I then heard the guy try to open it. I did not hesitate, and I got out my phone and called 911. When I told the dispatcher what was going on, I was told police were on the way. The guy knocked again very loudly and then tried opening the door. I could not see any of his actions though because the blinds were closed, and I certainly was not going to open them. I stayed as far away from them as I could. In fact, I went right by the door in case the guy broke the window or something. He stopped banging on the window eventually though, and then things were silent. I wondered if he had run off into the woods again. The police got there a short time later. I told them what happened and went to check out the balcony. Then the police went to the woods and checked it out, and surprisingly they found a man hiding in the woods. It was the same guy, and when questioned, he tried running but was caught. I'm not sure what his intentions were, if he was trying to break in or what, but I'm glad the police found him.
When I was younger, every year for Christmas I would drive upstate to my aunt's house along a stretch of highway. I cannot for the life of me remember the name of this road. All I know is that it runs nearby Akron, New York. However, for most of the drive, it's through rural areas with little to no towns nearby. It was the dead of night, and my groggy self had gotten off a long shift and had to drag my ass to my aunt's house since my extended family was expecting me the following morning. Near halfway through the drive, I realized I was low on gas, which irritated me. My brother told me he had filled up the day before, so either he forgot or was just straight up lying. I saw this archaic looking sign for a gas station off the next road. It wasn't an official road sign, it was just literally a pole with a slab of metal attached with the sign saying, "Gas, off next exit," or something along those lines. It seemed a little sketchy, but people do the same thing with fruit stands on highways, so whatever. I pulled off the next exit on this dilapidated ass country road through dense woods. The whole thing was creepy and surreal. I kept expecting Leatherface to come running out of the trees with a chainsaw. Eventually I made it up to the gas station and quickly realized it definitely hadn't been open for years. It was all rusted and the convenience store's roof was caving in. The gas pumps had been taken out as well. I pull over next to it and check my gauge. Would probably only make it another half mile before running out, so I called AAA and they said they'd send a truck over. Now I just had to play the waiting game. I left my engine on because when the headlights were off, everything was pitch black and my paranoid self wasn't going to sit next to an abandoned gas station in the middle of forest and in complete darkness. So most of the wait went, well, uneventful. Until I sensed movement around the side of the old store, where my headlights were pointed. I look up and didn't see anything, so I just looked back down at my phone. Then, over the sounds of the night, I hear someone yell to me, "Hey buddy, come here," in this demanding tone. I look up, and no joke, there's a dude standing by the old store, looking toward me, illuminated by my headlights. He looked like a run-of-the-mill homeless guy. I was spooked and figured he must have been squatting there. As I continued to watch him, I rolled down my window and yelled something like, "Yeah, what's up?" Still mentally crapping myself. I had my foot ready to floor it out of there at the first sign of trouble. "You got any change?" "No, sorry, I don't, man." I look up at him, and he has this vacant expression, as if standing there stiff. I see more movement. There are heads. I'd say at least 20 or so heads peeking around the trees beyond the man I'm talking to. I can't see them clearly, but they're definitely people. Literally just heads staring in my direction from around the trees. I see another guy beginning to walk from around the gas station, and then I turned around and just sped off. I got as far away from that place as my tank would carry me, and then updated AAA on my location. Eventually the driver came back over and filled me up, and I didn't say anything else. But after he left, I wanted to call the cops, so I called the nearest town's sheriff department. They told me they sent a trooper over, and I gave them the location. When I got to my aunt's house, the trooper called me back and said whoever was out there was now gone, but they could tell a large number of people had been living there for quite a while. There were blankets, canned food, the usual things. That whole situation still freaks me out, but frankly, I can consider myself lucky I'll always have such a creepy story to tell. I'm just glad nothing bad happened to me. Most of the neighbors on our street are friendly. We look out for one another. We text, chat, and say hello when we see one another, etc. It's a very sweet feeling of a community. In the past, there had only been one household that wasn't interested in being friendly with any of us. An elderly woman, mid-70s. We'll call her Maud. And her son, who's in his mid-50s, and we'll call him Don. My partner and I attempted to wave and say hello, only to be met with cold stares. Once my dog managed to slip out of his collar and ran through their yard while Maud was getting out the mail. The glare I received from her while trying to catch the dog left me with a feeling hard to shake. You know that unexpected gut punch feeling? When you become the object of a stranger's misery and hatred? Anyways, we learned quickly to stay out of her way, and we even barely ever saw Dawn. The blinds were always closed tight. They rarely left the house, and no one ever visited. The last I saw of either of them was at the beginning of August in 2021. Dawn was getting the mail while wearing blue latex gloves. I thought it was weird, but in early October, one of our other neighbors reached out to ask if we'd seen Maud or Dawn recently. We had not. And suddenly, we were all too aware that their grass over there was 3 feet tall. The mailbox was so full that it couldn't close anymore, and papers were spilling out onto the street. Obviously, a welfare check was called. The neighbor who had put herself directly in charge of communicating with the police called shortly after the check and told us to sit down. Maud and Dawn were both dead, and had been dead for 6 to 8 weeks. It appeared to be a murder-suicide, the assumption being that he killed her. I paced the rest of the day in front of my living room windows, watching the crime scene van pull up, the officers in and out of the front door, taking breaks somberly chatting in the front yard. And then after a few hours, out came the body bags. The smell was something I'd never experienced before and will never forget again. The following weeks, I thought of how many times I'd walk by the house with my son and dog, while 2 bodies sat rotting. I stayed up for a few hours a few nights trying to find out anything I could. Nothing. No news stories, crime reports, or anything. So I dug into Maud's history. All I could find was that she'd been buried in a north field, dedicated to the unclaimed. I kept a close watch on the house, and researched the legal proceedings it would go through since there was no kin. Looking at that house had always felt cold and sad before, but now it felt dark, haunted. I became obsessed with Maud's story, with no way of getting any answers. Her house just staring back at me blankly every single day. Back in the spring, my young son and I were out catching fireflies. We would stand still, waiting for one to blink, and then run in that direction. It took us up and down the street multiple times. I know this is such a small, silly detail, but that night, I stared into Maud's yard for minutes at a time, waiting to see a firefly, and I swear not a single firefly blinked over there. I became so bothered by it that I stared longer, sure that if I stared long enough I would see one, but nothing. Complete stillness and darkness. I told my husband that I hoped someone would buy the property and just knock the house down. No one had any business living there now. Today, around a year after they died, the doors were opened and people I hadn't seen before were in and out, carrying bag after bag of what looked like junk. I texted a neighbor and asked for the intel, if he had any. He said the house and all of its belongings had been collectively sold and bought at an auction 2 weeks ago. These were the new owners, probably getting ready to flip the house. I typically don't shove myself into situations, but I just spent way too much time thinking about Maud, wondering who she was, why she was so angry, imagining what strange life her and her son had been living, and what their last moments were like. I knew I'd regret it forever if I didn't ask what was inside. So I did, and they invited me in. One step into the front porch, and more puzzle pieces fell into place. It was a hoarder home. There was barely anywhere to put my feet. Stacks on stacks of old fine china, pots and pans, vintage books and records, knickknacks, and countless boxes filled with God knows what, from the floor to the ceiling. The woman who had let me in said, "The mattress where it all happened is still here. You want to see it?" Slightly afraid that she'd think I was completely demented, but far more curious, said of course I want to see it. She led me into a bedroom, through the piles of leaning stacks of junk. She walked into a cramped small bedroom with a twin-sized bed, and then pulled the blanket back. If you've seen what decomp stains look like, then you can imagine what I saw. After processing, I asked, "So this is where Maud was found?" "I think they were both in here. I'm trying to piece it all together. I haven't even started in the other corner bedroom, but I'm hoping it'll give me some answers. I'll be here organizing and sorting over the next few days. You're welcome to join me if you'd like." I told her that I would love nothing more. So after all of these months, I'm excited to have a chance to get some answers to everything I've been wondering about. To get a sense of who Maud was. To possibly find a way to honor what seems to have been a very sad life. To maybe get some clues into why her son murdered her. Her son, who I found out shortly after seeing this house, was a deeply troubled sex offender. He was charged by the FBI for CP and soliciting a minor in 2014. I hope to do all of this without any bad energy attaching itself to me. I do keep wondering, why, if this was a murder-suicide, did the police not go into a deeper investigation? Is it because there were no kin to care? This is a relatively old story that my dad has told me a few times over the years. I myself have never been able to witness the house, through the description that I've been given by multiple men. 20-something years after seeing it, gave me a very vivid mental image. To begin with, I'd like to mention that my father is a very highly religious man. I'm a preacher's son, and he does not believe in ghosts or anything paranormal in the slightest. Nothing seems to spook him either, but he still swears up and down that he felt something unnatural that scared him, even just from mentioning the story to me on the rare occasion that he would bring it up. Back in the late 80s, himself and his friends would regularly hike over to the Waterfall Creek bed behind our farm and would follow the trails up until they eventually met the frontage road off the interstate. Well, one night they decided to take a different route, to go around the backside of another farmer's land, mostly just to see the animals because they owned emus and other large pets that weren't common in the local area. Supposedly after leaving the area and continuing into the woods, they managed to stumble upon what is described by all 5 men as a Blair Witch look-alike house. It was a very, very old home, and my dad claims that just looking at it gave him this ominous feeling. So of course, they all decided to go inside and check it out. Inside the house was a very vintage cottage-style home that was probably built in the late 40s or early 50s. The group was instantly met with writing and symbols in strange Latin-like languages, with a few English graffiti pieces that quoted a supposed satanic or pagan worshipping ritual, with certain pieces describing how to sacrifice a human soul to some supposedly demonic entity. My father still claims to this day that certain symbols were painted on the walls in blood, while others were clearly spray painted. And I find it easy to believe because he also worked as a firefighter for years before this happened and had a lot of experience with seeing human blood, dismembered bodies on the freeway after car accidents. Past the small living or kitchen area was a stairwell that was so small that their shoulders would physically brush the other side of the wall as they went up the stairs. It went straight and just stopped at a small landing, then turned right. So as you started up, you could not see what might be standing at the top. At the top of the stairs, a door led to a large attic-style bedroom, where actual chain and locks hung from one side of the wall, near a circular window at the end of the room, which was also completely covered in those weird symbols, as well as graffiti. And now more obvious and frightening large dried puddles of blood had been seeped into the floors and walls. Allegedly, once they were upstairs investigating the room, they swear that they heard someone moving up the stairwell behind them quickly. But when they looked back, there was nothing or no one there. Everyone essentially told me that it almost sounded like heels clacking on wood. So now completely spooked, they all rushed back down the stairs to see if someone was playing a prank on them and was hiding downstairs. Surprise, surprise, they found nothing and no new footprints in the dust and grime that differed from the ones that they left on their way in. To keep things interesting, I met with each of the guys separately to ask them about what they remembered, expecting to maybe find a crack or something to prove that maybe they were exaggerating. But when I asked them, I got the same answer from each of them with no hesitation. They all had the same details, right down to the minute that they entered the house and the minute that they left. But here's where it gets kind of strange. They left the house and for some unknown reason, decided to try to walk back from a different route, using a compass to approach from the east instead of the south. They did this test more than 10 times that night, walking from every possible route or direction, yet always came out at the front entrance of that house, even when the compass and common knowledge of the area showed that it was physically impossible to be at the south end of the house when they moved in a straight line from north, east, or west. There's probably some scientific explanation for all of it, but I haven't found one yet. These guys knew those woods literally like the back of their hand, and still do to this day. That final time the guys came back and found themselves standing at the front door of the house, they began to feel physically ill, verging on feverish, and finally decide it's time to give up, when one of them nearly faints, and as they turn to leave the man who nearly almost fainted, he looked up and points at the circular window at the front of the house on the second story. Everyone looks and immediately sees a tall female figure, hunched over, standing in the window watching them. Even though they see no features on her face, other than two large dark-colored eyes, and it sort of shuffled in place before turning and walking away, as if it was heading to the stairs at the end of the room. At sight of the figure moving, they all took off running through the woods, ending up on the side of the interstate about 3 miles from my dad's house. They eventually made it back to my dad's place, though they claimed they felt as if someone were following them the entire way. And my dad's cousin gets up and gets some water from the kitchen, only to announce that he swore he saw the same figure now standing outside of the kitchen window near the edge of the woods. Thankfully, nothing came from this experience other than a collective state of absolute terror, especially when the subject is brought up to this day. They wrote off what his cousin saw as paranoia, though 5 years later, they decided to return to see if the house was still standing. It had fallen in on itself. It was nothing more than a pile of rubble, and they never went back again. I always joked with my dad, would ask him what he would do if he went back and found the house standing the same way it had been back then, trying to give him a reason to let me go and see the place for myself. But with trespassing laws being far more prevalent in today's time, it would nearly be impossible without either getting shot or going to jail, as it's not on our property. I don't know. The story itself always gives me the creeps when thinking about it, but I never considered the story to be true until I did this little mock interview with all the men. And when I say these grown men are scared to death by the story, I mean it. Seeing them get physically worked up and frightened by just telling the story really caused me to be less of a skeptic. What do you guys think? Is it possible that they were just spooked and it caused them to see things? Or is there really something out there in those woods? This story takes place about 11 years ago. I was a senior in high school at the time, but it's the single most mind-boggling thing that I've ever experienced. It's also important to note that it happened mid-December. I'm from Iowa, and the winters here get cold at night. Like if you get stuck outside, you will die kind of cold. That plus snowfall makes everything dead silent. You can hear anything and everything inside the house and even immediately outside of it. Me and my best friend were hanging out in my family's walkout basement, just having a boring winter night playing video games. We were also the only ones home. The reason it was just us is because my mother went straight from work to a bar to grab a few drinks with coworkers. So me and my friend thought it would be a good idea to break into the family wine and live a little. As we were sitting there opening up the first bottle, I hear the door to the garage open and then slam shut. I immediately go, "Oh shit," and start looking for places to hide the bottle. My friend then says, "Hey, I thought your mom was supposed to be out all night." "She was," I replied. Then I hear a few heavy stomps and my mother yell out, "Anyone home?" I yell back up the stairs, "Yeah, just hanging out in the basement." I hear a few more steps move from the garage door toward the stairs, and then she yells out again, "Hey, can you come up here? I need your help with something. I need you up here." I reply back while frantically trying to find a good place to hide the wine bottle. "Yeah, just give me a minute, Mom." Then there was silence for about 20 seconds. "Anyone down there with you?" She yelled back in a more concerned, serious tone, in a voice that was slightly off from my mother's. This was the first thing that told me something wasn't right. Our family never cared if anyone was over, as our house was a very open house to all my family and friends. And her voice was just wrong. It sounded like my mother's, but it was missing something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Weirded out, I reply back, "Just Colton." After I yelled that back to her, I found a good place to hide the bottle and began walking up the steps to the next level. Now, as I'm walking up the steps, I couldn't help but feel the overbearing silence of the house and the slight electric twinge. Something isn't quite right. When I got to the top of the steps, I look over to where the door to the garage is, and also the kitchen right next to it. It's black, pitch black. All the lights were off, and there was no moon shining through any windows. I walk over to the kitchen, yelling out, "Mom, where are you?" No reply, just silence and darkness. I feel the electric twinge turn into full needles, my adrenaline kicking in full force. I have to get out of here as fast as possible. My mother was not home. I run back down the stairs, grabbing my coat along the way. "What's wrong?" Colton says. "My mom's not home," I replied as fast as I could, looking for my truck keys. "What do you mean? You were just talking with her." I could see the confusion on his face. "Look, man, there's no one home. We need to leave now." I took a few steps towards the back door that opens up into the yard. I see my dog shaking on the couch and my cat growling behind it. I couldn't leave them. I just knew if we left them, something would happen. "Are we leaving?" Colton said, still confused. "No, I can't leave them here alone. Something is really off, though. I'm gonna call my mom and figure this out." I pull out my phone and call my mother. She picks up immediately. "What's going on?" she answers. "Mom, were you just home? I heard you yelling for me from the second level, and when I went up there, you weren't there," I said, hoping that she was playing some sort of joke. "No, honey, I'm just leaving the bar. I wasn't feeling very well. Are you okay? What do you mean you heard me?" I fill her in on the whole story, and she rushes home. Colton and I stayed up in the basement with the animals until she got there. But before she did, you could hear something up the stairs. Not walking or sitting on things, but a pressure in the air, like a black hole was slowly moving from one room to the next. And the word that I would instinctively describe it as is hungry. When she got home, you could feel the thing leave just as quick as it came. Like an overbearing predator presence had just flown away. We've still never figured out what the hell was going on. And this is just one story of many unexplainable things that have happened to us. But this is the easiest one to write down, and the one that I was happy to have a witness to. My mother has passed away now, and I've moved to Arizona. But whenever I go back to Iowa and I see Colton, he still gets creeped out by what happened. I will truly never know what took place that night. But I know whatever it was that had my mother's voice, it was evil and hungry.
I'm a 36-year-old female in Sweden. I've worked in mental health care for the last 18 years, mainly with people with psychotic illnesses like schizophrenia. I was working at a group home for 9 years, and we're very close with my coworkers there, especially 2 females. The last few years I worked there, another female started working there. We'll just call her M, and the 4 of us grew very close. She was very timid, shy, friendly, and we all got along well. She was often on long-term sick leave due to her own mental health issues, so we didn't meet much at work. However, she always showed up at our after-work dinners, allowing us to stay in touch even when she wasn't well enough to work full-time. She told us that she had a history of schizophrenia, just like the patients we were treating, but that she was medicated and hadn't had any psychotic episodes for years. Since I have an education in psychiatry and extensive experience with schizophrenia, I had no judgment toward people suffering from the illness, and didn't bother me to be friends with someone who had such a diagnosis, and even after what I will tell you, I still feel the same way. In the summer of 2023, I had moved on to work at a new place, still within mental health, but this time in forensic psychiatry. Like a halfway house for mentally ill individuals who had committed serious crimes, though. And the 4 of us stayed in touch and still met for dinner parties. M told us that she had been evicted from her apartment because of an incident where she accidentally entered her neighbor's apartment in the middle of the night. She explained that in the huge apartment complex, all the doors looked exactly the same, and she had simply walked into the wrong door by accident. She claimed the neighbors had created a scene and reported her to the police out of pure drama. I felt that while eviction seemed out of proportion for that incident, perhaps the landlord took action because he had judged her based on her medical history, and I felt bad for her. I questioned her if something else had happened, but she insisted that that was the full story. In Sweden, it's very difficult to get a contract for an apartment after being evicted. You pretty much get blacklisted. M asked me if she could move in with me, and she said she was literally homeless, and I said, "Of course you can." I've always gotten myself into uncomfortable situations by saying yes instead of thinking about myself, and I had no idea how severe the situation would get when I said yes to M. I live in a small apartment with 1 bedroom, a living room that only fits a couch and a TV, a small kitchen, and a small bathroom. I also had 2 cats. We decided M would live in the living room, and I offered to throw out my couch so she could have the bed there, but she said she was fine with sleeping on the couch. I insisted on giving her a bed, but she declined. There's a door between the living room and bedroom, but only an open arc between the living room and hallway, so she wouldn't have total privacy. I hung up a thick velvet curtain to give her a sense of a door and more privacy. There's another door from my bedroom to the kitchen, so I kept the kitchen door open at night for my cats to go in and out. She wasn't working at this time because she was on one of her long-term sick leaves while I was working shifts. Sometimes I had to get up at 6 a.m. and sometimes I didn't get home until 11 p.m. I have severe insomnia, need to combine sleep medications, and even then I wake up easily. I told her I would appreciate if she could try to stay quiet on nights when I had to get up early, but that it was fine to be loud when I was off of work or doing evening shifts. She was a heavy smoker and coffee drinker, so I bought her a coffee machine to make her stay more comfortable. The coffee machine and sink are placed right outside my bedroom door in the small kitchen. The first night together, I had to get up at 6 a.m. for my shift. As usual, I had a hard time falling asleep. Em had been up several times that night to smoke, waking me up each time. At 5 a.m., she started making coffee and the noise woke me up completely. I asked her nicely why she was waking up so early, wondering if she had any plans. She said she couldn't sleep. I explained that I really needed that last hour of sleep because of work and asked if she could wait until 6 a.m. to make coffee. I also mentioned that my epilepsy gets worse when I don't get enough sleep, and I was at risk of having seizures at work if I didn't sleep enough. She said that she wanted coffee with her cigarettes, but would try to wait next time I had to work. Despite this, she continued to wake me up early in the morning and throughout the nights, insisting that she needed coffee with her cigarettes. I suggested making coffee the night before or drinking iced coffee or Coke instead, but she refused. She demanded silence at 10 p.m. because that's when she wanted to sleep, and I respected that. She also had moments of binge eating, emptying my fridge and pantry. Once, she ate an entire loaf of bread within 30 minutes of me leaving the apartment, promising to replace it once she got money. I had also told her to feel at home, so I couldn't really get mad, but it started to annoy me because of the cost and inconvenience. Em had long black hair that was everywhere, on the sink, floor, and bathtub. I'm not a clean freak, but it was unpleasant, and she also left fingernails and toenails on the bathroom floor and drops of urine on the toilet seat. I saw a silverfish on the bathroom floor which feeds on hair and nails, likely enjoying its dessert. I initially tried to imply the need to clean by putting a broom and shovel in the bathroom, but it didn't work, and I eventually asked her nicely if she could clean the bathroom floor more often, using we instead of you to avoid making her feel attacked. She promised to think about it, but nothing changed. I started dating a guy and was head over heels for him. He was also in a roommate situation, so we had a tough time getting alone time. I asked him if we could have one night to ourselves occasionally, but she could have the apartment to herself as well. She claimed that she had nowhere to go, no friends or family. I wasn't asking for 24 hours, just a few hours for quality time, and she eventually accepted after some persuasion and stayed with a friend one night while I stayed away the next week to give her more alone time. One morning, I found my cat's water bowl completely dried out. There was no spill, and it looked wiped out with a towel or paper. I had filled it the night before. She claims that the cats must have tipped it over, but there was no evidence of a spill, and my overly social cats began to withdraw from her, spending most of their time in my bedroom, which was unusual. I had an old saucepan from the 60s that meant a lot to me because it was my grandmother's and held nostalgic value. She burnt it and made no attempt to clean it, just left it on the stove and went out for a smoke. I found it ruined and cried, and she didn't even apologize. She also broke dishes several times without replacing them or apologizing, and this added to my frustration. After 2 months, she kept waking me up at night, binge eating my food, never cleaning, never leaving the house, scaring my cats and ruining my things. I realized that she had stolen my prescribed sleeping pills. I had 20 in my nightstand when I left for work, and they were gone when I returned. She denied it, but no one else could have taken them. The summer heat was strong, and I felt locked up in my tiny bedroom with my 2 cats. I never got any time to myself or alone time with the guy that I was dating. My apartment was messy, and she was stealing from me. Out of nowhere, my old elementary school classmate texted me on Facebook and asked how I knew Em. He had seen my Facebook post about us being roommates. I told him that we were old coworkers and that she needed a place to stay because she got evicted, and he said, "I know. Do you know why she was evicted?" "Yeah, she accidentally went into her neighbor's apartment," I replied. He said, "That's not the full story. She broke in and snuck up to their sleeping baby with a knife in her hand. The father woke up and wrestled her down, saving the baby." I felt sick to my stomach. Could this be true? It would certainly explain why she was evicted, but it sounded so horrible. She seemed so timid, and my friend had the full police report. Apparently, the couple that she broke into was his ex-girlfriend's family. It seemed Em had a psychosis during the break-in, but those parts weren't public. It was clear that she had been lying about what happened and how long she had been mentally stable. I started getting paranoid and wanted her to move out. We had a contract with a 30-day notice period. I knew asking her harshly would mean 30 days of chaos, so I wanted to handle it nicely. I started looking for cheap hostels for her to suggest so that she wouldn't be on the streets. I sat down with her and explained that I missed my alone time and the apartment was too small for 2 people. I said it wasn't personal and that I wouldn't want to live with anyone right now. I expressed regret and hoped that we would remain friends. She looked crushed and said it wasn't possible. I showed her the hostel I found and explained that I needed her to move out because I felt suffocated. The summer heat made it tough to keep the door to the bedroom closed and I needed my sleep. She said that she would try to move out, but not until the 30 days had passed, and I agreed. The first night after our talk, she got up and made coffee at 2:30 a.m. I nearly had a mental breakdown. I was going to get up at 6 and couldn't go back to sleep. I asked her in the morning for probably the 10th time to wait until I got up to make coffee, but she didn't even answer. She just sat on the sofa and stared out the window. I was freaked out, but left for work. She kept being weird, making a mess, waking me up, eating my food, and all I could think about was the incident with her and the baby and the knife. Eventually, I got so angry about being woken up by the coffee maker that I unplugged it and stored it in my attic, which she had no access to. It may be childish, but I was going crazy and just wanted her to stop. The next night, I woke up at 4 a.m. to her making coffee in a saucepan. I tried talking to her again, but she just stared and didn't reply. In my frustration, I stored the saucepan in the attic too. The third night, the guy I was dating was sleeping over because I was getting really paranoid about her weird behavior. I woke up to him poking me, whispering, "Look." In the doorway, Em was just standing silently, staring at us. It was like a scene from a horror movie with her long black hair over her face. I didn't say anything at first, wondering if she was doing something by the door, but realized that she was still just standing still, staring. It reminded me of the ending of Paranormal Activity where Katie just stares at Micah. I sat up and said, "What are you doing?" But before I could finish, she slammed the door shut and I heard the sound of something metal falling and her running into the living room. I yelled, "You need to leave!" and just started crying hysterically because this was turning into a literal nightmare. Of course, I didn't go back to sleep and was really happy to have company that night. I kept asking myself if she had done this before, staring at me in my sleep. The next day, I opened the door that she had slammed shut and saw a kitchen knife on the floor. And that was the metal sound that I had heard. I took all my knives and locked them in the attic. I asked a friend to come over when I told Em that she had to move out immediately. During the conversation, I tried to stay calm, knowing that she had a mental illness and meant no harm despite my frustration. She didn't answer me, just stared out the window. She left the apartment and sent me a text saying that I was disrespectful for bringing a friend over to her place. That night, I thought that it would be quiet without the coffee maker or saucepans. But at 3 a.m., I woke up to her burning dry coffee powder in a frying pan, and I was terrified. Her face was dead, her eyes black, and I suspected that in that moment, she was in a psychosis. I stopped the fire that was starting and she ran off to the living room in silence. She had an appointment with her psychiatrist the next day, and while she was away, I packed all her things and sent her a text telling her that she needed to pick them up and return my keys. I offered to give her money for a hostel for the remaining 26 days, and she didn't reply. The guy I was seeing came to keep me company in case she fought about it, and she didn't. She left the keys without looking at us and left. Our coworkers told me that she moved in with the guy that she was dating and stayed there for a few weeks until she somehow got an apartment on her own. She started working again, and I was always happy to hear this, and she seemed to be doing well. Then, in January, one of our old coworkers told me that Em had called her saying everything must burn, she had a baby to save, and some other very delusional stuff. She had called 112, the Swedish emergency number, but they hadn't taken it seriously. Em then proceeded to burn her entire apartment down because the voices in her head told her that she had to burn everything to save her friends and family. Her neighbors tried to rescue her, but she fought them off and ran back in, pouring liquor on the fire to make it burn more. She was arrested and sentenced last week for aggravated arson, and she will serve her time in a mental institution/prison for a long time, possibly forever. Ironically, she will probably be in the facility where I used to work and where she used to work herself. My old coworker was a witness at the trial. Apparently, M had stopped taking her medication, the Abilify, because she felt that it made her numb and thought that she was stable enough to function without it. Apparently not. She had also stopped taking her medication the last few weeks that she stayed at my house, which explains her behavior. It's disturbing to think about what could have happened to me and my cats if she had stayed, or if I had been a heavy sleeper. I also think about what could have happened to that baby that she snuck up on before she was evicted. I know it's crazy that I just didn't throw her out sooner. It was complicated. The reason I haven't been able to talk about it with my friends is that they sympathize with her and minimize my experience. They think I'm making a bigger deal out of it than it was, and I sort of understand since they never saw the darkness in her eyes that I saw in those last couple days.
This incident happened back in 2014 when I was last committed to a psych ward for a suicide attempt. A little background: I am female and was 19 at the time. I was coming off of 3 years of bipolar medication while at a peak of substance abuse facilitated by my first year in college going crazy with new adult freedom. One night I had a big mental episode and was committed for the first time in the adult ward. Previously, I had only been admitted in the minors ward during my adolescence for similar episodes. Within this unit, you had to share a room with the same sex but weren't given any proper introductions. The facility as a whole wasn't managed effectively, nor did any of the nurses or doctors seem to care other than to prescribe and get you out. I was lead to the room I was staying in, and the nurse just said to the other lady in the room, "This is your new roommate," and left. The woman appeared to be in her late 40s or early 50s, Hispanic and just a little taller than me. She would not keep her gaze off of the floor in front of her and didn't say a word or move when I said hi. I noticed she had a tattoo of a cartoon version of the classic Red Devil, but as a baby, I figured I'd just leave her alone and stick to my area of the room. The first night went as they normally do in a psych ward. My roommate declined to share anything yet again, only staring at the floor, barely moving an inch. While everyone was lining up to be given their medication before bed, the ward across began to start banging on the glass of the door and screaming. One guy was smiling while banging his bald head against the glass window part, while the guys behind him were screaming and jumping around. It seemed as if they were almost going to break through, but orderlies came and took them away with their screams still lingering through the halls. Being in psych wards before, I wasn't surprised by out-of-the-ordinary behavior like yelling or fights starting, but this was completely different to me. I was with disturbed adults now, people who had years of illness deteriorating their mind, not little angry kids anymore. I actually felt scared for the first time because of the high level of unpredictability with these people. I knew I wasn't all there in the head, but even these people had me anxious and made it difficult to try to get any rest that night. You know that feeling of being awake but you haven't opened your eyes yet? The moment where you are barely waking up and everything is fuzzy. This is the state of conscious I was in later that night. I felt as if something was waking me up, yet still tired, so I wasn't opening my eyes. The more I came to reality, I felt pressure on my forehead, and I could sense sweat dripping on my face. I opened my eyes to find the roommate standing over my bed, staring me in the eye with one hand on my forehead and the other in a balled-up fist on her chest, while she speaks in what I assume is tongues. I look into her eyes and they are blank and empty of any emotion. She keeps speaking faster and getting louder. I am paralyzed at this moment, not sure what to do or what she would even do if I were to yell or move. It was only us in the room, and the nurse's station is all the way at the end of the hall. She started wiping the sweat off my forehead while still speaking fast and erratic, and I wasn't sure what she was doing or planned on doing next. She then put both hands on my forehead, and at this point was screaming while shaking me, but not long before a nurse came in and took her off me. The nurse seemed more irritated that she had to get up and do her job, rather than concerning of how I was doing or feeling. She escorted the woman out and said to don't worry and just go back to sleep. I don't know how, but I managed to fall back asleep. I assume she got transferred to the more severe ward because I did not see her again the next day, and luckily, I was able to leave later that day. This incident has since been a reminder for me to never go back and to manage my mental well-being, because while I have issues, I could be in a far worse state of mind. I still wake up some nights with lingering anxiety and have to calm myself down to go back to sleep. When I was accepted into a college that was far from my hometown, I didn't really know anyone else who lived there. The college I went to didn't have dorms, but they did have apartments that they suggested students live in due to the proximity to the college. I was pretty broke at that point, plus I wanted to meet some new people right away, so I chose my apartment largely due to a roommate matching service they had. Basically, you fill out a questionnaire about your demographics and hobbies, and the service would match you with roommates that were compatible with you. Mind you, I chose this particular apartment despite the 1-star reviews I saw across the board online. I mean, they were under new management, and it was only a year lease. It couldn't be that bad. I was matched with another guy in a 2-bedroom, 2-bath apartment. I was so excited to move in and meet him. I moved in a few days after the lease started, probably about 3 weeks before school started, and already began regretting my decision. The apartment was and smelled like mold and old cigarettes. In fact, there was a used ashtray on the coffee table when I first got there. My new roommate didn't show up for about a week. When he did finally show up, I found out he was about 35 and didn't even go to my school. He was pretty scruffy and smelled like old cigarettes and BO. Eventually, I found out that he used to be homeless and took out student loans to afford the application fee and first few months' rent, but he never enrolled in classes. After the first few months, he stopped paying rent, and it took about 6 months for the property to finally evict him. While he lived in my apartment, he never changed his clothes. He always wore the same beat-up-looking camo pants and stained, dirty wife beater. I even offered him some clothes I was getting rid of that would have fit him fine. He was content though, so whatever. He would also have a lot of his old roommates from when he lived at homeless shelters over. It wouldn't be uncommon for me to come home to a random person doing laundry, even when my roommate wasn't home. When I would have a guy over to hang out in my room, he would watch us walk from the front door to my room through a crack in his door, just wide enough for me to see the creepiest look on his face. Literally every time. Needless to say, he gave me the creeps. A few months after school started, and after I was noticing his creepy behavior more and more, I was in my room asleep with a guy I was talking to at the time when I hear a knock on my bedroom door. I look to the clock and it's about 3 in the morning. I get up to go see what whoever it was wanted and open my door to a random dirty and old naked guy. He says he's a friend of my roommate and thought my roommate was in my room with me. I flipped out. Obviously my roommate isn't in my room with me. In order to get into my apartment, my roommate would have to let him in. And the apartment isn't very big, so it wasn't like my roommate could have gone somewhere else that his friend wouldn't know where he was. He was either in the living room or in his room. I throw this dude out and let myself into my roommate's room. This is the first time I've been in there, mainly because I have no reason to associate with him, and he's sitting in the corner doing absolutely nothing with his lights off, almost as if he was waiting for me to come in there. I ask him about everything that just happened, and he tries to play dumb like he didn't even know the guy. Someone had to let him in, and it wasn't me. I drop it, begrudgingly, because the eviction notices are piling up on his door. I figure it's just a matter of time until he's gone. In the meantime, I see the naked dude randomly in the apartment doing laundry a handful of times when I would get home from class. Finally, my roommate is evicted, and I think I'm done with that, and maybe we'll get another roommate that is actually my age or cool. A few weeks go by that are more or less quiet. Then one day I hear a knock at the front door during the day. When I answer it, I see the random naked dude standing there, thankfully clothed this time, with a trash bag full of what looked like disgusting laundry. He tells me that my roommate said it was cool if he came to use the washer, and starts to walk forward like he owns the place. I step in front of him and tell him that his friend doesn't live there anymore, and no, he can't use my washing machine. I close the door, lock it, and go back to my room. About 20 minutes later, I keep hearing a random noise from my balcony. I lived on the 3rd floor, so I figured it was just a squirrel or a bird out there scratching around. I keep hearing the noise, so I decide to investigate, and I see the homeless guy trying his best to climb up to my balcony. I told him I was calling the cops, but obviously by the time they get there, he's gone. That same day, I went to the property manager and asked what kind of roommate matching service works like that and demanded to get out of my lease. After some heated discussion, I persuaded her that it was probably in her best interest to just let me leave. I found a nice one-bedroom and never looked back.
This happened when I was around 9 years old. I'm 25 now, and it's something I'll never forget. It still gives me goosebumps to this day. I live in a terraced house, and my neighbors and I have our own little patio. There's a small road 10 meters from my yard where people do their Sunday walks on. Only a small fence separates my small yard and a patio from that road. I live in a pretty crowded area with several of these terraced houses spread around in my neighborhood. So seeing people walking on that road is pretty normal for me. Seeing random people standing on my patio is not. When I was 9, I usually got home from school about an hour before my mom got home from work. I lived maybe 50 meters away from my school, so my mom figured I was mature enough to be home alone. It was only an hour or so before she got home. So this one day, I got home from school. I did the usual thing, which was to make sure that I locked the front door and double-checked that the back door leading to the patio was also locked. Then I rushed up to my room upstairs to play as much PlayStation as possible before my mom came home and would make me do my homework. While playing, I heard this noise coming from outside my window. It was kind of like the sound of a cat, but my cat had been missing for over 3 months. Hope sparked within me, and I thought, oh my god, did he finally come back? I ran downstairs to check if it actually was my cat. The sight that met me gives me goosebumps again just writing this. There's a guy standing on my patio, a very tall man with black hair covering half of his eyes, making him look like a male version of the Ring Woman or something. I could hear him making this high-pitched sound, almost like a cat meowing. A brown liquid was running down from his mouth, and I could see him spitting out my dad's stomped cigarettes. He was actually eating from the ashtray. I was frozen, observing this. Eventually, I snapped out of it and screamed so loud that the man must have heard it. He didn't react, just kept eating from the ashtray outside. I ran upstairs to my room, locked the door, and called my mom, who then promptly called the cops. I've never been more terrified in my life. Laying in my bed, under my sheets, shivering with fear, as I continued to hear these high-pitched noises from that guy, eating cigarette stomps from the ashtray on my patio. Kind of blacked out for a moment, because the next thing I remember is the police arriving on the road by my yard. I hear them talking to the guy, saying stuff like, "Sir, what are you doing? Get over here or we will come down and arrest you," and so on. The man did not respond, but the high-pitched sounds was more frequent and got louder and louder. I then decided to look through the window, feeling safe that the cops were there now. I could see 2 police officers standing by my fence, one man and a woman. I no longer saw the creepy man, however, because he was standing directly 1 story under me and out of my field of view. The police jumped the fence, and I remember hearing that creepy man screaming louder than I'd ever heard anything before. He charged at the female officer with full force, and he knocked her out cold. The male officer then immediately tased the guy, leaving him shaking on the ground, still screaming. The policeman struggled to keep him on the ground while putting handcuffs on him, but eventually he did. After a little while, he managed to wake up the female police officer, who seemed to be badly hurt. He called for backup and an ambulance, and then he sees me standing in the window above him. The expression on my face must have been something else, because he just looked at me and said, "I sure hope you didn't see all that." Then I started to cry. By this time, neighbors started to arrive, wondering what the hell was going on. One of my neighbors, an elderly woman, made me come down. She took care of me until my mom came back home. The police then took the creepy guy with them in their car and left. But they promised they'd come back and talk to us about what had all happened. This is where my story takes an unexpected turn. The male police officer came back later that night and sat down with me and my mom to talk. He explained that the guy on my patio was actually diagnosed with severe autism. He had escaped from a facility where mentally challenged people lived. It was located around 5 kilometers where we lived. He explained that that guy had actually been living in my house 5 years ago, but then he'd been forced to move when his mom and his only caretaker died. Poor guy probably thought he was going to find his mom in my house. He missed the routines, and he missed living there with his mom. The police had to move him from the house that time 5 years ago because he was extremely strong and this was the reason he reacted the way he did when the police came that day. Still frightened, I told the police officer that they needed to make sure that this would never happen again, and he promised me that it wouldn't. After a few sleepless nights, my life kind of went back to normal, and the years went by and that man didn't come back. That was until 1 year ago. At this time, my mom and dad had moved out. I bought that house from them, and I'm still living there today. I was enjoying my morning coffee on the patio when I see this random guy stopping on the road by my fence. He just stood there, staring at me. I look at him and give him a nod, and then I hear it. Those same high-pitched noises. Holy... It's him. His hair had turned gray, but the high-pitched sounds made me realize who it was. My heart started racing, and I instantly remembered the reason why he was back. I realized that he must have managed to escape again, but because I kept my cool a bit longer than when I was 9, I started to realize how sorry I actually felt for the guy. 16 years later, and he was back to look for his mom. I decided to carefully ask him if he wanted to come down to the patio. He instantly jumped the fence. I started to think maybe he would knock me out like he did to that one police officer. He didn't. He just smiled. He looked at me and smiled. I offered for him to sit down, and he didn't respond. I offered for him to come inside, and he just started laughing. So we ended up going inside. His face lit up, pure joy. He was home. It reminded him of the life he had with his mother. It actually almost made me tear up. And all of a sudden, he sat down on my couch, turned on my TV, and switched directly to the cartoons. I sat and observed him for a while. He was just completely focused on them. I wanted him to just enjoy the moment, so I didn't say anything. I realized I had to call that facility and let them know what was going on. The caretakers arrived 10 minutes later. After a lot of convincing, he got back up, crying, and went back to the facility. I called the facility 2 days later, and we made a deal. His name is Tom, and I now consider Tom my friend. Every Sunday from the day he returned, Tom and his caretakers visit me to watch cartoons. They tell me it's the highlight of his week. It makes my heart warm. Now, for several years, my thoughts were, let's not meet guy on my patio eating from the ashtray. Now my thoughts are, let's meet every Sunday to watch cartoons with my friend, Tom. I was 14 years old, and it was just an average night, and it was around 9 p.m. Myself and my little cousin are at his house, and I'm babysitting for the night while my mom and aunt are shopping and my dad and uncle are at the movie theater. As we're sitting there, I started to feel really strange, like something was wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. So we just kept watching TV. That same feeling wasn't going away though, so I got up and walked to the back door to lock it. And when I came back through the kitchen, I saw what was causing my weird feeling. In the window, there's this very decrepit and homeless looking man, just staring at us. Protective mode turned on immediately, and I pretended like I didn't see that guy, and told my little cousin that we needed to go upstairs, because our parents would be home soon, and they wouldn't want him staying up so late. We went upstairs and I put him to bed, knowing damn well that there was a man outside, and I think that he wanted in. I was about 125 pounds and 5'8" at the time, and I played football for my school. If I remember correctly, I went downstairs and straight into the kitchen, and grabbed one of those meat tenderizing hammers. Turned back to the window, only he now wasn't there. I ran back to the front door and made sure that it was locked. Both the deadbolt and the knob were, and I ran back upstairs with the meat tenderizer. I went into my cousin's room and sat down in front of the door. He asked me what I was doing, and I told him not to worry about it and just to keep his head low. I called the cops, and then my dad and uncle. The cops were at least 30 minutes out, and my dad and uncle were 45 minutes. Then I heard it, a window shatter, and the sound of heavy boots walking around on our main floor. Quietly told my cousin to stay calm and hide under the covers and keep silent. I could hear that man walking around downstairs. It was horrifying. I gripped that damn meat tenderizer and just waited. Maybe 5 minutes or so pass, and then I hear the boots walking up the stairs. At this point, I was having a freaking heart attack. My cousin's door is no more than 10 feet from those stairs. I heard him opening up the door to my aunt and uncle's room, then the bathroom, He walked back downstairs, and I heard him open the door to the basement. 15 minutes later, the police showed up and burst into the house. It turned out that the guy was loose from a mental hospital 1 province away. I nearly had to battle a mental case when I was 14, and at one point, I was no more than a wooden door and 10 feet away from him. My parents started leaving me and my sisters home alone when I was around 13 or 14. Of course, the rule was to not let anyone we didn't know into the house. One night, there was a knock at the door. I went to the door and tried to look out, but I couldn't see anything. We couldn't pretend that we weren't there because the lights and the TV were both on. I opened the front door a crack, thinking that the person would be behind the screen door, but that wasn't the case. There was a man in his late 20s or early 30s just standing in our doorway. I shut the door quickly and told him to get behind the screen door. He obliged, and I cracked the door. Yes, I wasn't very smart, and latched the screen door. He told me a story about his vehicle breaking down the road and needed to use a phone. I said that I couldn't see his car, and he indicated that it was further down the road. Then I asked him why he walked past 2 houses right next door, and then walked to the one with no car in the driveway. And I could see that he was becoming agitated. Here's a general recollection of that conversation.
Look, are you gonna let me use the phone or not?
No, my dad is sleeping, and I can't let you go into his room to use the phone.
Okay, just bring the phone here and I'll use it then.
I'm not letting you in the house.
Just bring the phone to the door.
It won't reach. Please leave.
Okay.
I shut the door and lock it. And while my sister and I are talking about how scary that was, the side door handle begins to jiggle. That same man knocked and says,
Hey, will it reach this door?
At this point, I tell him to go to the neighbor's house and use their phone. And he starts to yell,
I bet your dad's not even home. Let me in. I want to talk to him.
I told him fine, I'll go get him. Then I went to my dad's room, got his shotgun, came out and racked it and said, Here, meet my dad. The same man started cursing and calling me names, but he did leave. Or at least that's what I thought. He actually had gone around to another door and tried that one. Our dog, who was outside at the time, began barking at him. He proceeded to do something that made my dog yelp and cry out. I screamed out that I was calling the police, and he finally left. I felt really stupid for the entire interaction. I don't know if he was just a guy who needed a phone, but that whole experience was very creepy, and I was obviously ill-prepared for dealing with it at such a young age. This story happened to me back when I still lived at my parents' house. I was commuting to college at the time and had 3 siblings that also lived at home, my brother and 2 sisters. For some context, we lived on 5 acres in rural Ohio, surrounded on both sides by woods and farm fields. Additionally, during the week, my dad would normally leave for work around 2 a.m., so I always felt like it was my job to be the man of the house because he was gone during the times when you would imagine something sketchy happening. However, on this night, because it was the weekend, my dad was actually home. I woke up to the sound of my brother's voice trying to get my attention. We had separate rooms, but if you came out of our room, you could look down over the banister and see our front door. When I woke up, it took a few moments to get out of that haze and realize what was actually going on. I looked at the clock and it was around 2:30 a.m. My brother told me that there were 2 men at our front door. Now this really woke me up. We quietly walked out of my room to peek down and look down to the front door. When we looked, there was no one at the door, but I noticed my parents off to the side and out of view of the glass on that front door. I whispered down to my dad, and he told me that there were 2 guys who had been talking to one another and knocking at the door. Hearing my dad say this freaked me out even more. I went back into my room and grabbed my pistol, quickly shuffling down the stairs after looking to make sure that they were still not at the door. If they had been, they would have easily seen me coming down the stairs, as it's in direct view. My brother is right behind me as we head over to where my parents are, whispering to my parents to find out what was going on. parents had awoken to the sound of our dog barking, only to find two men knocking loudly at the door. At this point, those two men returned and began knocking again. Despite the fact that no one had came to the door the first time, or that our dog was still actively barking at them, and also the fact that they were there at this time in the night, so late, and in a location where houses are spread out hundreds of yards away from each other. And again, knocking with the dog barking. It just made the situation even more terrifying. After a couple of minutes, the men walked away, and we all shuffled across the kitchen and into the family room to peek out those windows into our driveway. There was a black Cadillac sitting there, but no one was inside from what we could see. Immediately the question was, where did those guys go? They weren't in their car, and they were no longer at the front door. We would quickly get an answer to the question we just asked. All of a sudden, the handles to our back French door started jiggling, and they were actively trying to enter the back of our house, which entered into the kitchen. At this point, I just remember my mom frantically saying, "David," to my dad, as pure terror overwhelmed her. Then two things happened. Adrenaline filled my body as I prepared my handgun, horrified at the very real possibility that I might have to shoot these men. Secondly, my dad finally grabbed the phone and called the police and calmly told them what was happening. Thankfully, after a minute of jiggling, they stopped at the back door and disappeared once more, only soon to be back at the front door, knocking once again. After a few minutes, we suddenly saw the local police fly up in multiple cruisers with their lights turned on. As they whipped into our driveway and into our front yard, the two men bolted and attempted to run the long way around the house across the driveway. One of them disappeared out of view, but the other one was intercepted by an officer yelling for him to get on the ground. He didn't. He was immediately tased and fell. A few of the other officers went around the house after the other guy, and one of them came to talk to my dad and I as we came outside. They ended up finding the other man hiding in my sister's little playhouse in the backyard. It appeared that both of them were either drunk and or high, as the one who hid had cocaine on him. While they were both arrested that night, we never did find out what they were charged with or what happened to them. Needless to say, that whole experience wasn't fun. So to the random men at our door in the middle of the night, let's not meet again. The first house I moved into out of high school while going to college was a very old small house in a town that dated back to the Civil War. I lived there with 3 other guys since rent was really high, but we made it work. The house itself was built on a hill and had a small driveway in front with a U-shaped driveway in the back. It had a full basement and was owned by someone with multiple rental properties in that area. They told us that we had full access to upstairs, but they used downstairs for storage and to never go down there because it was full of their stuff. We never really questioned it because the rent for this particular location, especially for our area, was low. We were still technically on campus, but our house was surrounded by other college students, so we could have parties whenever we wanted to. Everything was great until we started having unwanted visitors. At first, things were pretty easy to ignore, or easy to write off. A roommate home by themselves would walk into a room, and the lights would be on when they were home alone and hadn't flipped any of the switches. Or someone would hear a faucet turn on and off in a room with no one inside it. We tried to do what little research we could at the time, and found out that water pressure can cause faucets to do some crazy things on their own, and also that power surges can do similar things with flickering lights. Unfortunately though, things kept getting stranger and stranger. At one point, one of my roommates who was home alone got out of the shower and looked into the mirror to start shaving. He noticed someone else stepped out of the shower behind him and left the room. He searched the entire house but couldn't find anyone else inside. Later on, a different roommate had several items go missing out of his room, including his keys and pocket knife. He later found them in our microwave. Again, no one was home at the time. Me personally, I got home on a day when nobody else was at the house for a couple of hours in between classes. There's a folding chair on the front porch next to the door, and I had an armload of books. I set the books down on the chair, unlocked and pushed open the front door. I bent down to pick up my books, and the door was slammed in my face. I Thought maybe the wind had caught the door and then went to open it, but discovered that the door had locked itself again, both the handle and the deadbolt. Last of all, 3 of us were sitting together on a couch watching TV when we heard a loud, heavy thud, as though something had been dragged off into a back bedroom. All 3 of us later confirmed that we distinctly heard both footsteps walking through the house, as well as the sound of something heavy being dragged. Last of all, the back door opened and slammed shut, even though we were all inside the living room, and there was supposedly no one else in the house. Around a week later, we started to smell gas inside, and we called the authorities in the middle of the night. They searched the house, with us waiting on the front lawn. They finally came outside and told us they couldn't find any kind of gas leak, and then asked us to open up the basement. We had never been down there because of our landlord's request, but since the fire department was asking, we opened the garage door. Right in front of us was a Honda Shadow motorcycle with a large pool of gasoline underneath it, where the tank had apparently leaked underneath it and the rest of the house. The firefighters saw this and decided to leave, while we were left to look around the rest of the basement. Most of what we found was shelves and shelves of canned food, but in the very middle of the floor, which was underneath everyone's bedrooms, we found an embalming table, some sort of second device. I'm still not sure what the second device was. It was cylindrical, with a small viewport in the front door, and it seemed to have some places on the back for hoses or pipes to connect to it. Although nothing was attached when we found it, it was around the size of 2-liter bottle sodas. Soon after, we would come to find out that our landowner worked night shifts at a local hospital. Whatever it was or whatever was going on inside that house, we decided that enough was enough, and we all decided to move out as soon as our lease was up. Unfortunately, I was the last one there, and I promise that last 7 days I spent there alone were the longest days I spent anywhere since. I'm a self-described cynic, and I don't believe anything when it comes to the supernatural. But I can also admit when I have absolutely no explanation for a set of events. I'm sure the Reddit scientists will be able to explain everything that happened to me now that many years have passed. But I don't really need their explanations anymore. I just accept that being in old houses alone is not a good idea, and still to this day I do my best to avoid them altogether.
Maybe 2.5 years back, I met a chick at a bar. She had been stood up and I'd just knocked off for the day. I didn't go there with any idea to score. I just wanted a couple of pints to help me unwind. I'd been there for around 45 minutes when the bartender slipped me a note. It was from a girl sitting at the end of the bar. She asked me to grab a table with her so we could talk. My curiosity was piqued, so I looked to my right and locked eyes with possibly the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. I thought that maybe I'd been given the note accidentally. No way a girl that hot was interested in me. To make sure, I pointed at the note and then mouthed, "Was this for me?" Then pointed to myself. To my amazement, she nodded yes. That's where our evening began. I grabbed a quiet table in the corner and she joined me. We introduced ourselves before getting to the small talk. Her name was Amber and she was 25. Close up, she was even more beautiful than I thought. I asked her why she'd written the note. I was genuinely curious. While I'm not a walking mess, I was nowhere near her level. The possibility I was being tricked came to mind, so I asked if I was being pranked, but she said no. It wouldn't be the first time. My friends seemed to think it was funny that any girl would like me. They put notes on my windshield at least twice pretending to be from a secret admirer. I never fell for it though. I'm far smarter than they think I am. This, however, looked to be a real encounter. If it was, I was going to play it all the way through. The getting to know each other continued another half hour until she asked if I wanted to take her home. I jumped on it, and we walked a few blocks to my apartment. We had a few more drinks and started messing around. I don't kiss and tell, so I'll just say we enjoyed one another's presence for the rest of the night. When I awakened the next morning, she was already gone. I wrote it off as just an amazing dream and hit the head. When I came out, a pair of beer bottles caught my eye. I walked over to get a closer look. One had lipstick residue on the mouth. I still wasn't positive. I walked over to the bed and sniffed the pillow opposite to mine. The wonderful smell threw me back to the previous evening. There was no doubt. It had really happened. I was over the moon for a long time. I hoped to see her again. I went as far as asking some employees if they knew how to find her, but none did. As time went by, however, I wrote it off as just a one-night stand. I began dating a new girl, a wonderful, fun chick to be around, but Amber stayed in the forefront of my mind. This new relationship never really went anywhere, and we ended things a few months in. Being newly single, I had hoped to track Amber down and maybe pick back up where we left off. I returned to the bar and asked around again. I got the same answer. I didn't have the money to hire a detective. Without a last name, I couldn't even do a search on the internet. Providence would arrive in the form of Craigslist. I was browsing the site and came across the missed connection section. It looked to be just as good as any other avenue, so I made a short description of our night together and how I'd like to meet up again. I posted it and went on with my life. All was quiet until day 8. A message came from someone claiming to be Amber. I asked a few questions. They knew all of the answers and even added things no one else could have known. I was overjoyed to be talking to her again and asked if we could meet for drinks. She agreed and suggested the place where we first met. It sounded perfect, almost romantic. I started to believe this may go somewhere. My months-long search was over. For the rest of the week, my stomach was in knots. I was counting the hours. Saturday eventually arrived and I made my way to meet her. She was visible from outside and more beautiful than I remembered. I joined her at the table, and the night went as much as it had on our first meeting, all but one thing. Throughout the evening, she checked her phone many times. I assumed that she was just nervous and tried to ignore it. It was a few hours before she then suggested we go back to her place. I'd been looking forward to this for months. On our way out, I visited the bathroom. As I walked away, I noticed that she was fiddling with her phone again. However, now she was making a call. I didn't care. Besides, maybe she was just calling her roommate. She was basically a stranger to me. For all I knew, she had kids. Once again, I didn't care. I mean, she'd hung up by the time I returned anyway, and we made our way to her car. I stumbled my way down the street until she pointed to this plain four-door sedan, and I then shuffled up to the passenger door. She unlocked it, and I fell into the seat. We closed our doors, but instead of starting the car, she just sat there looking at me and smiled at me. Oh, maybe she wants to make out. The idea perked me up. When I leaned over to kiss her, a strange male voice told me to stop. What? I was so drunk that I had a difficult time assessing the situation. I turned my head to the back seat and saw a large masked man pointing a gun at me. "Don't make me shoot you, cowboy!" Instantly, I sobered up. I could tell that he meant every word. I looked over to Amber. Our eyes met, and I knew I'd been tricked. They were cold, lacking any empathy. I was devastated. I lost my desire to live at that very moment. Moving much faster than I should have, I yanked my wallet from my pocket and threw it into the back seat. I think my nonchalance caught the man off guard. He said nothing, even as I stepped from the car and slammed the door. I didn't know what to do, so I just stood mute, staring at the pavement. It remained quiet for around 30 seconds until I heard the car start and then speed away. It wasn't long before I had a massive adrenaline dump. The seriousness of what had occurred mere minutes prior hit me like a truck. I hunched over and began vomiting. Massive amounts of booze and nachos poured from my guts. I eventually ran dry and returned to my feet. I wiped my mouth and made my way home. I wanted nothing but to sleep, and I didn't even bother to undress before falling into bed. Most of the day was gone when I woke up. I chugged a bottle of Gatorade, which was my hangover cure. The events of the previous night became clearer by the second. I felt so stupid, all the time that I'd wasted looking for her. Then I got angry, and my desire for revenge kicked in. A quick shower and a 2-mile walk later, I found myself filing a report. In Chicago, stick-ups generally don't get much attention. When the detective handed me some mugshots, I got the idea that I'd stumbled onto something a tad more serious. I was shocked to see the faces of Amber and her accomplice staring back at me. I pointed them out, and the detective gave me the lowdown. Only at that moment did I realize just how lucky I'd been. According to him, I had fallen prey to a scam. Amber's real name was Shannon, and she'd been a career con artist. The pair had been targeting single men for the last 6 months or more. I was thought to be their 5th victim, and the previous 3 had been killed. I felt a shudder through my body. The detective was unsure why I'd been allowed to live. That made 2 of us. Perhaps our history made me too much of a risk. Maybe she'd been pressured into doing it by her partner. I'll probably never know. It was hoped that I had some new information to give him, but I ended up being no help. We spoke a little longer before he sent me home. Now I was even more confused. I was happy to be alive, but on the other hand, however, I wonder why I'd been spared. I have one particularly funny theory, that they didn't consider $23 on a maxed out card worth killing over. But the truth is, it's not really a joking matter. Things wouldn't get any clearer when Amber's accomplice was arrested. He'd been brought in on unrelated charges, only to lawyer up the second he was asked any questions. He'll stay mum more than likely, even when presented with the possibility of execution. The detective on my case thinks Amber probably won't be caught for a long time, and even if she is, she'll go the way of silence too. If and when she's caught, I hope I can get a few minutes alone with her. Not because I wish her any harm. I've come to terms with her role in the crime. Instead, I'd like to ask why I was spared when others weren't. I'd like to think it's because we made some type of connection on an emotional level. Then again, that's probably just my romantic side thinking out loud. In truth, it probably just wasn't my time.
This happened to me back in the early 2000s. I was living with my ex in Texas. My girl and I had been forced to move cross-country after we lost everything in a house fire. We were in a very bad position, and when all hope appeared to be lost, her family offered to rent us a place that had been just sitting, unused. The few things that survived the fire were packed into our old Jeep and we hit the road. 2 days later, we arrived at her Aunt Jenny's house, road-worn and ready to get moved in. We didn't have much, so it didn't take long. Although we had to spend the first night in sleeping bags on the floor, it was a giant first step toward getting our lives back. Early the next morning, we went shopping for a new bed. It was probably the most satisfying event in my life up to that point, and I never slept better than in that bed. Maybe it was just the relief of having a stable place to live, but I still look back at that time with fondness. The next few days were spent scouring Goodwill and charity shops for furniture, lamps, and such. And by the end of the week, we were settled in, and it was time to look for work. I've never been averse to hard work. Maybe I'm a masochist, but I've always sought out the most physically strenuous jobs I could find. I think a lot of the employers I encountered were a bit shocked at how hard I pushed myself. My insane work ethic has a lot to do with my upbringing. I was one of 4 children in a very poor family. We lived in a remote part of West Virginia, and life was beyond tough. Going to bed hungry was a regular occurrence, and although I was not above raiding the neighbors' gardens in the warmer seasons, my Christian morals stopped me from becoming a full-blown criminal. I'd rather not go into too much depth about my folks, but suffice it to say my dad's love of the good life meant he rarely had a job for very long. Mom did the best she could, but she had her hands full taking care of us, and as soon as my last sister got old enough to go to school, Mom began working part-time with her sister at the dry cleaners. Once I was old enough, I took her place there, and she moved on to better paying work. Dad and Mom had split up by then. Life only got harder after that, but somehow we all survived to become useful members of society with families of our own. At that time, there was plenty of work to be had. Texas was just beginning to grow in the economic powerhouse that it is today, and everywhere I looked, houses were popping up and new people were moving in. Folks were hiring for every imaginable position. I'd done landscaping work before, so it seemed logical to try. I bounced from job to job, site to site, doing any work that had let me. It put food on the table, but working in the Texas summer was rough, and the rainy days weren't much better. For some crazy reason, I turned to the food service industry. I was trading one hot place for another. Stupid in retrospect, but I'd been a line cook after high school. I knew my way around a kitchen. There are a few things in the South people like more than eating, and our area was overflowing with places to do it. I landed a part-time position washing dishes. The pay was all right, but I was getting killed on gas costs in the long run. I was about to go back to landscaping when I got a call from a Waffle House. The pay was better and the location was less than a mile from our home. I could walk to work and Missy could take the car if she needed to, and it seemed like the best thing to do. Now we could both work full-time rather than juggle our schedules with one car, and I went for the interview and was hired in less than 15 minutes. Missy was over the moon to hear it, and I'll admit that I was pretty excited too. Stable work, no matter what it is, can go a long way to ease your money concerns. Missy's boss had been nagging her to take on more hours, and now she could. Overall, things were beginning to look up. As I walked to the restaurant that Monday night, I had the worst case of butterflies in my life. For some reason, my instincts told me this job would be like none before it, and boy, did I turn out to be right. My first couple of weeks turned out to be relatively uneventful. There were occasional drunks getting a little rowdy, but they usually calmed down if we were assertive enough. The rest of the staff were cool too. Most of them were older than me, but they didn't take themselves too seriously. When it was slow, we'd talk about where we'd come from and our hopes for the future. But when we were slammed, everyone kept their heads down and got the food out as quickly as possible. And everything was going really well until one Friday night, when an especially drunk man came in looking for trouble. In Texas, the bars usually closed down at 2 a.m. Around 2:30 or so, the drunk stumbled in looking for something good and greasy to soak up all that booze. Waffle House is a very popular place to do so. On this night, the regular group of bar patrons came in for their late-night meals, and since this was a smaller city, we knew most of the people that came in. The overwhelming majority were salt-of-the-earth hard-working folks just looking to let off a little steam. They were harmless for the most part. Unfortunately, this situation was going to be different. From what I recall, it was just before 3 a.m. when a very intoxicated stranger staggered into the restaurant. I didn't recognize him, but I was there to cook food, not vet people. And anyway, the drunk man paced around, occasionally stopping at tables and then walking on to the next. Most of the other patrons ignored him and focused on their meals. And that was until the drunk man stopped at the bar and began leaning too close to one of the regulars, and I'll just call this guy Mike. Mike had been coming in on the weekends way before I was hired, and I'd bet he still does. Mike had his own share of drinks and must have been annoyed at the other man's presence. He started barking at the man to get away from him, and he told him he stunk. The stranger took offense to this and tried to take a swing at Mike, but missed. Mike pushed him down onto the floor and stood up from his stool. He was looking down at the stranger, shaking his finger at him while he cursed him out. The drunk stranger stumbled back to his feet and rushed toward Mike. He managed to punch Mike in the chest and stomach a few times before Mike pushed him away again. The stranger fell back onto the table behind him and just stared for a minute before turning and running out of the restaurant. I chuckled to myself as I watched the brief fight before turning back to my work. A few moments later, I heard a woman's voice say something like, "You're bleeding from your chest, Mike." I turned back around to see Mike wiping at the front of his gray shirt. There were a few dark spots on it, and when Mike looked at his hand, there was what appeared to be blood on it, and that was when we realized the drunk stranger had stabbed him, not punched him. It looked like he managed to pull out a knife during the scuffle and got a few quick jabs before Mike could stop him. I'm not sure what made me do it, but I ran to the back and grabbed a stack of hand towels, and from there I ran over to Mike and began putting pressure on the wounds. By now, Mike had dropped to the floor from shock, I think, and a few other patrons helped me hold the towels on the wounds while we waited for the ambulance to arrive. This whole time, Mike was talking about his kids. I did my best to assure him that he was going to be okay, but to be honest, I had no idea how serious his injuries were. About 7 minutes later, the ambulance arrived and whisked Mike away. We had to close things down while we talked to the police. And just before dawn, we were able to get things up and running again, and all I could do that morning as I walked home was think about Mike. I continued to wonder about his condition that whole weekend, and when I showed up for work that Monday, I was told that he had a rough time but was now out of danger and recuperating in the hospital. For the next few weeks, I was given little updates by some of the customers that knew his family. He was doing well and enjoying his time off of work, though. I think almost 2.5 months passed when I was standing at the flat top and heard a familiar voice behind me. I turned around to see Mike standing there with his big toothy grin. I asked how he was doing, and he said he was great. And we shook hands, and he gave me a big hug. He thanked me for saving his life. I wasn't sure if I had, but I wasn't about to be rude, and I could tell that he was serious. I quickly mentioned the others and tried to be humble about my part in it, and from there the subject just veered off onto other topics and I returned to my work. I'd continued to see Mike regularly for about a year until I got a better paying job elsewhere. It's been at least 15 years since I last saw him, and I hope he's still doing well. I'm not sure if the drunk guy that stabbed him was ever caught that night. It never seemed appropriate to ask. He moved on with his life, and I didn't want to stir up bad memories. Mike, if you do happen to hear this or see this, give me a call. I'd love to catch up. I used to work at the Waffle House in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. People sometimes ask me if I ever saw one of those Waffle House brawls or anything like that, but honestly, it really wasn't that kind of place. We were just down the street from a bunch of bars and stuff, and the Lehigh College campus was less than a mile away, so we definitely got our fair share of customers during the midnight hours. But I think during all the night shifts that I worked, I only saw maybe 2 or 3 physical confrontations, and those mostly consisted of a little shoving before the 2 people about to fight were separated by their friends. And that's not to say that I didn't end up quitting after a very violent incident. It's just that the incident in question happened to be considerably more messed up than some dumb street brawl. As you can probably guess, weekend night shifts tended to be the busiest when it came to drunk college kids or sports fans stopping by for all-star specials. But the weekday night shifts could actually be pretty quiet. You'd get your giggly stoners staring at the menus for like 20 minutes before ordering, but there were never any trouble at all, and the same went for the truckers and shift workers who came in the store cold sober for their patty melts and hash browns. But then this one night, we had this super sketchy crackhead-looking guy walk through the doors, and I swear to God, when he first walked in, I was like 90% certain that he was about to pull out a gun and rob us. The Waffle House I worked at never had a single robbery for the whole time that I was employed there, but it was still one of your biggest fears when it came to working the night shifts. And whenever anyone came in who fit that profile, basically anyone who looked like they were on crack, we always got a little nervous and kept an extra eye on them. The guy was definitely high on something, and not only was he twitchy as hell, but after ordering his food, he just sat in his booth, intermittently looking over at us without even touching his grilled cheese. I let my coworkers know that the guy was giving me some pretty bad vibes, then carried on cleaning down my station while kind of low-key scoping him out. As I'm watching Mr. Twitch, some regular-looking white guy with dark hair walks in and then orders a coffee and a piece of triple chocolate pie. My coworker serves him, and he takes a seat at the counter to drink his coffee, so I just keep on cleaning while I watch Mr. Twitch. Mr. Twitch looks up, and we make eye contact for a second, and then he looks back down with this sort of nervous expression. like he's either high out of his mind or something and the paranoia is kicking in, or he's thinking about doing something crazy. And I'm getting more and more nervous, but then to my left I hear, "Don't I know you?" And I look around to see that Mr. Coffee and Pie is turned around on his stool and is talking to a guy eating in the booth behind him. The guy in the booth is like, "I don't think so." But then Mr. Coffee and Pie is like, "No, you went to such and such elementary school. You were in my 4th grade math class with Mrs. So-and-so." And I can hear that the guy at the table having a bit of moment of recognition, but I wasn't watching them like I was watching Mr. Twitch. They go back and forth about how crazy it is to run into one another in a Waffle House at 1:30 in the morning, and then start reminiscing about this and that and the other. I lost track of their conversation when I went to get some more cleaning supplies, but when I returned, they were wrapping up their chance encounter with a few good to see yous and take cares. But then, out of nowhere, Mr. Coffee and Pie stops by the door and says, "Oh, and one more thing." Then I look over, just in time to see him pull a gun from out of his jacket. The guy sitting in the booth didn't stand a chance. He looked up just in time to see Mr. Coffee and Pie pull the trigger, and then after 3 shots, the guy slumped forward onto his half-eaten plate of food. The place was so quiet after Mr. Coffee fired his gun that after I ducked down below the counter, I heard the sound of the gun hitting the floor after he dropped it. I stayed down below the counter while I heard the door open and close, and then everyone stayed silent for a few more seconds until some lady started screaming like a goddamn banshee. At the time, there wasn't really any kind of contingency plan for someone getting shot in the face at your Waffle House, so we did the only thing we could think of, and got everyone that hadn't run off to walk behind the counter so we could guide them out into the rear parking lot. Naturally, everyone was extremely shaken up, and the woman that had been screaming was hysterically crying. The restaurant was closed for a few days after that because obviously the cops had to perform all kinds of crime scene analytics and forensic stuff. Waffle House offered us free counseling and a bonus to anyone from that shift who would return to work. But unlike my 3 coworkers who were working with me on the night of the murder, I didn't take management up on their offer, no matter how generous it may have seemed. Now call me a coward, but I just figured, why go and work back at a place like that? Where every time I wiped down a table, every time I looked at it, I'd be reminded of that guy slumped over in his food, with that stream of blood just oozing off the table onto the floor. I take my hat off to anyone that could just go back and act like nothing happened, but to me personally, I'd rather just get a job someplace else. Someplace I don't have memories of someone getting murdered right there in front of me.
A few years ago, I was driving back from work pretty late at night. I was going home, and normally I don't work quite that late, but it had been a long one. At this point, I was extremely hungry, and I hadn't had a chance to eat in a long time. On the drive home, I didn't normally pass by many restaurants. I happen to live a little bit out in the country, and there aren't a bunch of places to go to, so I was keeping my eyes out for a place to stop, and I remember I pulled off the highway and I took an exit. My options there were a gas station, and then a little ways down the road I saw a sign for a Subway. At this point, it was probably like 10-something at night. I didn't know if Subway would still be open, but I thought that I would go and look. So when I drove down the road, it appeared as though the Subway was open. The lights inside were on, and I remember that I thought I saw somebody in there when I was driving into the parking lot. However, there weren't any other cars in the parking lot. I decided to park, get out, and go to the door to see. When I did so, the door opened up and I realized that it was in fact open. At least I thought. After walking inside the Subway, it was very quiet and I didn't see anybody inside anymore. I walked up to the counter where you start ordering. I figured the employee was maybe in the back or something, and after they heard me coming in, they would probably come out to take my order. Just a few seconds after getting to the counter though, the lights suddenly turned off and it went almost completely dark. The only light was coming in from the large windows that they had in the front of the store. I looked around wondering what was going on, After maybe 30 seconds or so, I figured that I would just leave. But before I walked away, I heard some noises coming from the back, which was around the corner and out of my sight. That's when I saw a man coming into view. It looked like he had entered from the back room, and I thought that it was an employee at first. I couldn't see the man very well at all because of the dark, but with the light that I did have from the window, I noticed that this man was not wearing a subway uniform in any way. He just stood there for a moment looking at me. I decided that I would leave still. This situation overall just seemed very strange, so I began to head over to the door. But when I did, I heard the man start walking from behind the counter. I didn't really know where he was going, but it actually sounded like he was going towards me. When I reached the doors, I glanced back and saw the guy swiftly walking my way. He was maybe 20 feet away from me. The man did not say anything, and neither did I. I just left the subway and started going back to my car. I then heard the man actually leave the restaurant after me. I looked behind me and the guy was getting closer. At that point, I wasn't sure what else to do, so I just started running. I sprinted all the way to my car, unlocked the door, and got inside. Luckily, I didn't have to back up to leave because the parking lot connected to another one, so I just hit the gas and drove away from there. The man had almost reached my car, but I left him standing there in the parking lot and I drove away. I then went all the way back home, not bothering to stop any place else. I was too creeped out by the situation and made something to eat at home. Now, I still don't know exactly what was going on in that subway. I'm guessing that they were closed, but for some reason the door was open. Was the man that I saw attempting to steal from the place, or was he just chilling in the back? I really don't know, but I do know that he chased after me, and I'm glad that I got away. One time last year, I went to a Subway at night. I was just going to get a sub, and the Subway restaurant was only about 5 minutes from my house. It was located in a quiet strip mall that had several other businesses in it. So I went there at probably about 8 p.m. I remember that it was completely dark out because it was the springtime, and the area was also pretty quiet. Most of the other businesses in the strip mall were now closed. I walked inside of the Subway and I ordered. It didn't take very long because nobody else was there, and then I got my sandwich. I remember that when I was getting a drink from the fountain, I noticed a man passing by on the sidewalk out front outside of the Subway. The man was somewhat tall, had shaggy looking hair, and was wearing a t-shirt and sweatpants. So I remember that he looked in the window at me as he was passing by, but then he continued walking and went out of sight. After I got my drink and stuff, I walked out and I left the Subway. I was starting to walk to my car in the parking lot when I heard somebody approaching me. There were footsteps a little behind me and to my right. I looked over and I saw the same man. He was approaching me, and before I knew it, the man was right next to me. I stopped to see what the guy wanted. When I did, he asked me if I could give him a ride over to the gas station and pointed in the direction. The way he pointed, there was a gas station within sight, and it really wasn't that far away at all. It was kind of in the direction of where I lived too. Obviously, I didn't want to give this man a ride though. I didn't know him or anything, so I said to the guy that I was in a hurry to get home. But as I started to walk away, the man followed. He said that it wasn't far, and he just needed to go to the gas station and was meeting a friend there. I finally said yes and told the man that I would give him a ride. I feel stupid saying that, because obviously it's not smart to give a ride to a random person you first see at night. But that's what I did, and I was just hoping that it would be a quick drive to drop the man off. I mean, it would take less than a minute to get to the gas station, and it was within sight. It was just a little bit to the left of the strip mall and almost behind it. And the gas station was open, and there looked to be several other cars there. So the man got in the passenger side of my car, and I got in the driver's seat. After getting inside, the man was nice and said thank you to me, and said that he was really cold and didn't want to walk all that way. It was pretty cold out with it being the early spring and nighttime. So I left the parking lot of the strip mall where the Subway was. Then I drove out of the parking lot onto a busier street. After we went to the left, the gas station was just to the right, but the entire drive, neither me or the man said anything. It was just awkward silence. After I turned into the gas station, I pulled into a parking space in the back side of the parking lot. It had been a quick and easy drive, When I stopped though, the man did not immediately get out of my car. So I said something like, "All right, have a good night now." But he didn't get out. He just sat there. It was really awkward for like 30 seconds, and I was getting a bad feeling about this whole situation. At this point, I was kicking myself for letting a stranger get in my car at all. So finally, I said to the man, "We're here. Isn't this where you wanted to go?" The man finally spoke. He said this wasn't the correct gas station. He said it was another one that was a ways down the road, and he pointed to the east. That was not the direction that I was going. I thought the man needed to go to this gas station, and I was sure that's where he pointed. I told him this is where I thought he was going, and he said no, as if I was stupid for thinking that. I told him that I was not going in that direction and I had to go home now. He didn't respond, and he didn't get out either. This man seemed really annoyed with me that I somehow didn't know exactly where he was going. I told him I couldn't go there, and I wasn't going any further. He did not seem happy about it, and did not get out of my car. The man told me to drive him to the other gas station. I was getting pretty nervous. I didn't know if this guy could possibly be dangerous or something like that. I asked him to get out of my car, and he said no. At this point, I didn't really know what to do. Then, as we were sitting there, I noticed a police car pulling into the gas station. When I saw this, I was thinking maybe I should try to get the cops' attention. But as I was still thinking that, the man next to me suddenly got out of my car. He opened the door, left my vehicle, and then started quickly walking away. The guy started heading towards the building, and then I just left. I went home, and I told myself that I would never let a stranger in my car again. Looking back, I'm not sure what that guy was planning to do. I figured that when he saw the cop, he knew he was up to no good, and he left. I'm really glad that the police officer pulled into the parking lot when he did.
As all of you know, life can be a struggle sometimes. Making ends meet isn't always as easy as just getting a job. Several years back, I couldn't find a job. It was rejection after rejection. And at the time, nobody was really hiring, and the few places that were hiring were very ultra-competitive. I was barely making over minimum wage as a deli employee at a grocery store. I remember one night I was working online for ways to make extra money, and I ended up stumbling upon Craigslist. I had heard of Craigslist but never really explored it for myself. I found an ad on Craigslist for a freelance job where I would be what's called a secret shopper. For those of you who may not be familiar with what a secret shopper is, it's basically an anonymous customer who comes into a store and asks the employees a series of questions. The employee is then graded on certain criteria. For example, does the employee make eye contact, greet you, give a suggestion, offer to escort the customer, and give a parting comment, etc.? It seems simple, but a lot of companies, specifically the store I work for, will reprimand the employee for a bad secret shopper score and even fire the employee if they get more than one bad score. Since I had experience in a store and I know exactly what they're looking for, I thought that this would be an easy way to make some money on the side. The first store I visited was a local chain of grocery stores in my hometown. Oddly enough, it was the same company I worked for, but not the same store though. I started making my rounds and noticed a man, probably in his 20s, stocking the shelves. He looked at me and immediately put his head back down. He didn't greet me, so he got points off right away. I had to greet him and ask him where the canned tuna was. He never lifted his head from stocking the shelves and just sort of angrily said, "Aisle 2, halfway down." Again, this guy lost points for not making eye contact and offering to show me where it was located. Also, just for the record, I know how ridiculous all of this is, but these stupid companies take this junk so seriously. They don't care if you're waiting on another customer or what the excuse is. If you get a bad score, you're kind of screwed. I was trying to pause and give the guy a chance to redeem himself by telling me to have a good day, but he never did. And I eventually had to initiate the parting remark, and that's when he finally looked up and said, "Yeah, you too." And I finally saw his name tag and wrote down on it was a name, Patrick. And I smiled and walked away, and I noticed that Patrick kept his eye on me. I felt his stare as I walked away, and I started to figure that he was on to me, that I was maybe a secret shopper. I was going to ask a few more employees questions, but I started to feel uncomfortable. Every time I looked up, I could see this Patrick at the end of the aisles. It almost seemed like he was following me. I wasn't sure what the end game was for this guy, but I didn't want to find out. I cashed out and the cashier passed her secret shop with flying colors, though. And after I cashed out, I briskly made my way to my car, and I just wanted to get out of the store so bad and be done with this. Once I was in the car, I started writing down the full report before I drove off. I just wanted to get all the information down while it was still fresh. But while I was writing, I looked up and saw my buddy from the aisle intensely walking through the parking lot, Patrick. I ducked down a little bit, but thankfully it didn't appear like he had noticed me. He just kept walking until we got to his car, which was a dark 4-door sedan of some kind, and he sped off, and I waited a few minutes before I departed. I don't know why, but this guy just gave me the creeps, though. I kept thinking to myself, why was he following me around the store like that? If he really was, but it truly did feel like he was, and it just felt so weird. I'm a textbook overthinker, so I tried telling myself that maybe I was overthinking, but something about him was just definitely off. That night, I went home and I emailed my supervisor the report, and life went on. It only took a day or two for me to completely forget about that interaction. A few nights after I turned in the report, I was having a late-night dinner with my boyfriend. We were just hanging out, enjoying each other's company. The relaxing evening was interrupted by a loud and consistent banging on the front door. It wasn't just an aggressive knock either. It was like the sound of someone throwing their entire body weight at the door. You have no idea how horrifying it is to hear a knock at the door at that hour, let alone a banging knock like this one. We looked out the window, and I was at a loss for words. It was that Patrick guy from the grocery store, and he looked horrible. His eyes looked like they were sunken in, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. I called out, telling him to leave right now, that I was calling the police, and he didn't even flinch. He just kept banging and demanding that I let him enter the home. Repeatedly, he kept saying that I ruined his life, and that I needed to pay. That there would be an eye for an eye, I remember him saying. I didn't even want to think about what he meant by that. And while this interaction was happening, my boyfriend had called the police, though. They must have been in the area because the first squad car showed up in less than 2 minutes. And it's a good thing, too, because I don't know how much longer my door was going to hold up. Patrick was really throwing himself into the door, and this whole sight was nuts. A cop tackled Patrick right on my front steps and handcuffed him, and while they were apprehending him, they ended up finding a knife concealed in his waistband, which for me was the most terrifying information about this entire ordeal. I still can't stop thinking about what he intended to do with that knife if he had broken down the door. After he was arrested, I did get some closure on this whole nightmare. It turns out it was just a situation of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Apparently, Patrick was at the end of the cliff, and my visit to the store that day was what forced him to fall completely off. He was struggling to pay his bills, and from what I was told, his girlfriend had just broken up with him the day of that secret shopping event. And when I approached him in the store that day, he was only minutes away from the end of his shift and was just mentally completely done at that point. I get it. We've all been there. Well, to a degree. And I happened to catch him on a bad day, and asking for a can of tuna was the last thing on his mind. He ended up losing his job because he had failed another secret shopper report, a report that I sent in. The part that I can't still figure out about this is I have no idea how he found out where I lived. I don't think he followed me that day after the store, but there's no other way that he would know where I lived. I stayed at my boyfriend's house after that night, and I rarely stayed at my old house alone. I don't know what happened to this guy, but I genuinely hope that he figured it out, and more importantly, I hope these stores get rid of the secret shopper program because it's just horrible. Not long ago, I decided to listen to a friend of mine about picking up some babysitting jobs from Craigslist. I know that seems weird, but I was surprised at how many postings for that type of work were on there. Ordinarily, I wouldn't have needed the job, but at the time, I had just broken up with my boyfriend, and I didn't think that I was going to be able to pay my rent. This seemed like the easiest way to make some money. It helps that I used to babysit when I was a teenager, and my brother has 2 small kids, so I felt like an expert in the field. After all, how hard could looking after some children for a few hours be? I set up a job for early Saturday evening, and I started messaging a woman named Chloe. The woman said that her and her husband would be leaving the house at around 5:15 p.m. and they would be back sometime after 10. She gave me the address and all the information about the children. I would be watching 2 boys, and one of the boys was 7 and the other was 9. I was figuring that this was going to be easy money. In my opinion, boys that age are easy to entertain, and because they weren't babies, they wouldn't need my undivided attention. After I talked to the lady, I told my friend about the job, who was jealous of the money that I was about to make. She had been doing the Craigslist babysitting jobs for a few months now and had never come close to the money I was about to make, or at least told that I was about to make. On Saturday evening, I made my way to the address given to me by Chloe, and right away, I had some regrets. The house was in a very sketchy neighborhood. Not necessarily crime-ridden, but it was a poor and run-down area. When I knocked on the door, there was no answer. I waited for several minutes and attempted several more knocks on the door when, finally, a strange and very rough-looking man answered the door. He was tall and skinny with this massive gray beard. I would say that he was at least in his 50s, unless he just looked rough for his age. And in this very low and gruff voice, he said, "Come on in, sweetheart. Sorry I didn't hear the knocks. My ears ain't what they used to be." I walked inside, and the first thing I noticed was how not child-friendly the house was. A lot of trash and just general clutter was lying about, and I was just standing in the front of the door, and the man then says, "My wife should be back any minute with the kids. Go and sit down and make yourself at home. Sorry, I know the place ain't the cleanest." I was trying not to be judgmental. I know it sounds like I should be running for the hills, but I didn't want to unfairly judge this guy or his family. And the man pointed down the hall and told me that the living room was in the back of the house. I made my way back there and sat on this bluish couch. The amount of anxiety I felt at this moment was absolutely crushing, though. I saw no pictures of children, no toys, and no indication whatsoever that children even lived there. While I was waiting on the couch, I could hear the man walking back and forth in the other room, and I think he was mumbling to himself. Every few minutes he would begin to shout, "Hey, sorry about this, ma'am. My wife can be forgetful with the time. I promise she'll be back soon." A few minutes later, he ran into the room scratching his head. With this big smile, he said, "You know what? I'm an idiot. I bet my wife came inside with the kids through the basement entrance. She's probably waiting for you down there. Nobody uses the front door that you came in, and the basement's right over there. Why don't you go check it out, and I'll meet you all down there in a minute." He stood there like some scarecrow, pointing to a door on the far side of the room. I didn't know what to do and just nodded and told him I would go check, and truthfully, I had enough at this point, though. He smiled and in this very unsettling voice says, "Well, that's great. I'll see you in a second, sweetie." And then he walked back into the front door. I opened the door to the basement out of curiosity, and it was obvious that nobody was down there. The lights were off, and the smell was just horrific when it hit my nose. There was no chance I was going to go down there. And while staring into the dark basement, I heard that he was still bumping around in the front room, and without thinking, I ran as fast as I could toward the front door that I came from. Once I hit it, the door was locked. I quickly unlocked it and ran for my car. As I opened the car door, I could hear him yelling from inside the house, but I didn't look back. I started backing down the driveway, and I could see him running out of the house, waving his hands back and forth. And thankfully, by the time he reached the driveway, I was already flying down the road. I almost didn't call the police because technically I was physically fine and maybe even overreacting. But after calling my friend, she convinced me to call the authorities just in case. After the phone call, I had no idea what had happened. The dispatcher on the phone told me that they would take it from here and that was the end of it, at least on my end. Maybe there was a wife and kids. Maybe this was just a poor family that I just very unfairly judged. Maybe there really was an entrance to the basement that his wife used instead of that front door. But honestly, I'd rather look like some crazy jerk who judged the family than potentially be the victim of something very much worse. The unnerving nature of the situation told me to run, and I stand by that gut feeling. That very well could have been the best decision of my life.
Last year, I was trying to sell my 2007 Mercury Mariner. It was in pretty good shape, but had a lot of miles, and it's kind of old. But overall, it ran very good and is a good car. I decided to list it on Craigslist because I've had experience buying cars on there before. When I had used Craigslist in the past, it had gone pretty well. So I took several pictures of the car and then listed it. The next day, I didn't get any interest at all. But on the second day, I got a response to the ad. The text message came from a man saying that his name was Al and that he wanted to buy the car. He seemed pretty confident about it right away. I was asking a pretty reasonable price, so I gave him my address to come and look at it. Now, I lived in an apartment building. I didn't think it was a big deal to give out the address, because there were several buildings in the complex. My car was already parked out in the parking lot, and the guy would have no way of knowing which apartment was mine. So I asked Al when he was free, and he said he could come by the next day after work at 9 p.m. I said okay, and then I cleaned out the car and got it ready for selling. The following night, I left my apartment building and went to my car in the parking lot. Al showed up shortly after and parked nearby. He got out and I met him by my Mariner. Al was a big guy, had lots of tattoos, was probably about 250 pounds and 6 feet tall. After meeting, I showed Al the car and he looked around at it. After several minutes, he asked to take it for a test drive. I went with him and Al drove the car around the block and down some nearby streets. I remember that he said he liked it and it seemed fine. At that point, I was really thinking that I was going to sell the car that night. After the test drive, we returned to my apartment complex, and he parked the car in the space that it had been before. But then, after we got out of the car, Al just said that he would think about it. I was disappointed, because it seemed like he was going to buy it before. But I just said okay, and then said bye to him. But that's when Al asked me if he could use my bathroom quick. This seemed sketchy. Why did he think it would be okay with me for him to use my bathroom? I said no thanks and started walking away. To me, I was afraid that it might be some sort of a setup. I didn't want this guy coming into my apartment. He was still kind of standing around by my car though. My apartment building had a side door and a front door. The side door was not very far away, so I decided to walk to the front. I left Al standing there and headed inside. I was kind of afraid that he was going to follow me, but when I left and got to the front doors, I looked back and didn't see him at all. This made me feel better and I entered the building. When I got inside, I turned to the right and then entered the elevator. I took it up to the 3rd floor, which is the level that my apartment was on. When I arrived, I stepped off and started walking to the left. But when I did, I saw the door at the end of the hallway open that led to a stairwell. I saw Al entering the hallway. What was he doing here? At first, I started going towards my door, but then saw Al going towards me. I quickly stopped and then turned and started walking in the opposite direction. At that point, I started to hear Al begin to run in my direction, so I started sprinting to the end of the hallway. When I made it there, I went into the stairs on the other side and ran down. As I was going down the stairs, I heard Al enter the stairwell and continue to chase me. Then I went into the underground parking garage beneath the building. When I got down there, I ran across it to the other end of the building. I had extended my lead on Al a little bit. I heard him get to the parking garage and keep chasing me though. Then I got to the stairs on the other side and ran up them to the ground level, then left through the side door. After I was out of the building, I ran to my car and got inside. Then I just left and drove away. I called the police while driving off and told them about the man. I drove around the streets nearby for a few minutes and then returned. When I did, Al's car was still there, and he was not inside of it. The police got there just a couple of minutes later. I didn't go back inside the building until they did, and when they did, they actually found Al attempting to break into another apartment. So it turns out he was never interested in buying my car. I guess he was just going to try to rob me or something. One time, I was going to buy a TV on Craigslist. This was years ago, but I would browse Craigslist at work all the time back then. Several times, I got really good deals or things for free. You never really knew what you would find there. But you also had to be very careful. So I found this really good deal on a nice TV. I was in the market for one, and the ad looked legit. The price was cheap, but not so cheap that it would make me wonder if it was too good to be true. The pictures of the TV appeared to be in somebody's home. I responded to the advertisement and said that I would like to buy the TV if it was still available. Within an hour, I got a text back from the seller saying that it was available. It was a woman who said her name was Joy. She gave me an address and told me to come over the following night to buy the TV. I looked up the address, and it appeared to be a house in a neighborhood that was maybe 10 minutes away. So the next day, I got the cash and drove to the address. I parked on the side of the street in front of the house in what appeared to be an average neighborhood. I think it was about 7 p.m. When I knocked on the door, it was quickly answered by a woman. She looked to be in her 30s and was about average height with dark hair. She said hi and invited me inside. I stepped into what looked to be the living room of the house. There were boxes around and stuff, as if maybe they were moving. There really wasn't that much furniture, and Joy said sorry that it was a mess, and I said it was fine. She then told me that the TV was in her bedroom. She then led me to the hallway and stopped and opened the door to the bedroom. She said the TV was in there, and I stepped inside. When I did, I noticed that the room appeared to be completely empty though. And right after I got inside, the door slammed shut behind me. It all happened so fast. I looked around and there was no TV in there. I turned back and saw that Joy had closed the door on me. She hadn't even entered the room. I walked over and tried opening the door, but it was locked from the outside. It was so weird. I knocked on the door and asked Joy what was going on, but she did not answer me. I kept trying the door for a minute or two, and it just wouldn't open. Then I was yelling for somebody to open the door, but was getting no response. After realizing that wasn't working, I looked around the room. It was a small bedroom and was completely empty. There was literally no furniture at all. I got out my phone and tried calling my friend, but I was getting no signal in there. I thought that was weird. I tried opening the door and calling for help again, but it was apparent that nobody was going to respond to me. I looked around the room, wondering what on earth was going on. Several minutes into this, and I started to hear noises coming from outside the room. It seemed like they were coming from the living room area. It was Joy and the sound of a man's voice. I couldn't tell what they were saying, but I could just hear that they were talking to each other. I yelled again, but got no response. After that, I went over to the window and tried to open it, but for some reason, it wouldn't budge. This angered me, and I went back over to the door and started banging on it as hard as I could. I wanted to break the door down. Then I heard a man's voice yelling at me to stop from down the hallway. I didn't know what these people were capable of. I did stop, but just for a moment. Then I took out my phone and found my alarms. I turned my volume all the way up and started playing the most annoying alarm noise. Then I put my phone at the far side of the room. I then walked over and stood just behind the door on the other side of that. Within probably 30 seconds, I heard somebody walking towards the room. Then they got right outside the door. The door then opened and a man walked in. He turned and first started going towards my phone, making all the noise. I came out from around the corner and ran past him, leaving the room. He tried grabbing me at the last second, but I just barely slipped by him. When I ran out of the room, I went down the hallway. Then, when I got to the living room, I saw Joy standing there. She sort of tried to stop me, but I was going too fast and got around her as well. By now, the man had started to run after me. I opened up the door, and when I was doing so, Joy grabbed at my arm. I just got out the door, though. They were both running towards me, and I sprinted for my car, and luckily still had my keys on me. I unlocked my car, got inside, and sped away from there. Now, sadly, I left my phone, so I couldn't immediately call the police. I stopped at the first gas station that I saw, went inside, and asked an employee to call the police. They got to the gas station, and after talking with police, we went back to the house. They recovered my phone on the side of the street a block up. When they went to the house, nobody was there. I found out that those people did not actually live in the home, and somebody else had been renting it. So I don't know if those two were ever caught. When I looked, the Craigslist post was gone. I just know that I'm never using Craigslist again after that.
This happened when I was in college. I lived in Isla Vista, a student community at UCSB, notorious for being a party school, and it fully lived up to its reputation. I like partying, but holy shit, these people were off the wall. As such, there were a lot of students who put themselves in dangerous situations, drinking way too much, not being careful, and forgetting to lock doors, etc. It had a very isolated vibe, and anyone who was hanging around who wasn't college-aged immediately looked out of place. One night after having a few drinks, I came home to my small house where I lived with my two roommates. It was probably around 2:30 a.m. We were all serious students, and when we partied, it wasn't your typical UCSB mega rager, more like a small get-together with friends. We would often have a few people spend the night, sleep on our furniture and our beds, as the case may be. That night my roommates had somebody over who I didn't know, and I saw that this person was sleeping on the couch. I didn't turn on any lights because I didn't want to wake him up. But as I was passing by the couch to enter my bedroom, I noticed the figure was lying very stiff. He gave off a strange vibe. It was like he was putting all of his energy into being as still as possible. I paused, and the guy quickly jerked his head to face me, without moving his limbs. It was so fast that it startled me. I could see his wide open eyes glinting in the dark. Figuring that I might have startled him, or perhaps he was drunk, or maybe on some kind of stimulant and was unable to sleep, I just hurried past into my bedroom and locked the door. That guy made me nervous, and I wasn't taking any chances. Eventually, I fell asleep. At 4:30 a.m., I woke up. There was a strange sound at the door, almost like somebody was drumming their fingers against the wood. I lay still and listened. There came more sounds, like somebody scratching the door with their fingers, which got louder and louder. It was clear that he was using both hands and scratching as fast and hard as possible. It created an extremely loud and intimidating sound that filled me with fear. I grabbed my phone and texted my roommate, "Hey, your friend is freaking me out. Is he doped up or something? Can you please go out and talk to him? He's banging and scratching at my door." She didn't respond, probably because she was sleeping. I texted my other roommate, but the end result was the same. Keep in mind that the scratching had been going on at this point for a couple of minutes. I have no idea how he could have sustained it. Scratching a wooden door with your fingernails can't feel that good. He also grabbed at the doorknob and tried turning it. Because neither of them answered, I decided to call and wake them up. I know it sounds dumb, but there was something seriously horrifying about being teased like this through the door. I knew that he was trying to scare me, and I felt like a little kid, but I could tell this guy was for something, and perhaps the police needed to be called. I wanted to loop in my roommates though, since it was one of their friends. The scratching stopped abruptly, and I called my roommate. who answered in a tired voice. Hello? Hey, your friend is messed up. Can you please deal with it? He's scaring the crap out of me, and he's scratching at my bedroom door. She didn't say anything for several seconds, and when she spoke, she didn't sound tired at all. What friend? The guy who was sleeping on the couch. We didn't have any guys over tonight. Call the police. Now. My adrenaline went through the roof. Before hanging up, I told her to lock her bedroom door as quickly as possible. I realized that I hadn't heard the scratching in a while, and I had no clue where the guy was. Suddenly, I heard a loud banging at the other end of the house, where my roommates, Lauren and Monica, shared a bedroom. The bangs were followed by the sound of screaming. I quickly dialed 911 as this maniac proceeded to bang against my roommate's bedroom door. Thankfully, they had locked it in time. The heaviness of the blows left no doubt that he was trying to break the door down. I told the operator the situation, and they dispatched 2 squad cars. The police in Isla Vista are generally used to peeling drunks off the sidewalk and breaking up brawling frat bros, but this was serious, and I think the dispatcher knew how terrified I was from my tone. She stayed on the line with me. At one point, the banging stopped, and everything was silent for a while, when suddenly I looked down and saw that the intruder had slipped his fingers through the 1-inch gap between the bottom of my door and the floor, and he was just kind of wiggling them around and making this weird growling sound. I screamed and backed away, which I instantly regretted. In hindsight, it would have been so awesome if I just stomped out of his fingers and heard him howling in pain. When the cops showed up, I heard him running and the sound of our sliding glass door opening and closing. He was gone, and the cops never caught him. My bedroom door was covered in these huge gouges that he had made by using a pair of scissors, which he discarded on the ground before he left. What terrifies me the most about this was that I walked right past him. I looked him right in the face. I realize now that he was not trying to sleep. He probably heard me open the door and freaked out because he hadn't realized that somebody else was living there. He was lying so stiff because he was trying to blend into the couch. In the fall of 2010, I decided to go back to college. I was a single mom of 3 boys, but they were all in school by now, and me going back was finally possible. The school I went to is a regional campus to a very large university, and located in a neighborhood that is known for crime, meth, heroin, prostitution, etc. But it was only a 20-minute drive from my house, and I didn't feel unsafe about going there. My first day there was intimidating. I didn't know anyone, and I was a lot older than most of the other students. I was 28 at the time. I sat down at a table in the back of the room, and a few minutes later, a woman who was around my age sat down next to me. She was very skinny, smelled like cigarettes. She had greasy hair and sunken eyes, but when she started to talk to me, she seemed normal enough. She started off the conversation by telling me that she sat close to me because I was wearing the prettiest blouse in the room. Strange, but as an awkward person, I give a lot of leeway for people who say or do awkward things before I think too much of it. She didn't have a backpack, any books, a pen or notebook, nothing. She said that her financial aid hadn't come through yet, but she didn't want to fall too far behind in class, and asked if I would share my book. I agreed, and gave her a pen and paper as well. After the first class, she asked if I wouldn't mind going with her to the library so she could scan a few pages from my book to take home. I agreed, and we began to head to the library. She stops and looks at her phone and says her son just texted her and needs her to come home to do something. She then asks if I could come with her. I tell her that I have another class and I couldn't go with her. I asked if she still wanted to go to the library first, and she said no, and that she had to get back to her son, but really couldn't go alone for some reason. I was confused, but I kept telling her that I couldn't go with her, and then she starts crying. At this point, we were in a common area outside, with the parking lot on one side and the library on the other. I didn't like being outside, away from people, with this woman anymore. She got really upset and started screaming at me, basically cursing me out. I don't remember how the interaction went exactly, because I was in complete shock by how quickly she transitioned from being friendly to crying and now screaming in my face. I turned around and began heading toward the library. I pulled out my phone and called my friend so that I would have someone else aware of this lady if she tried to do anything more than just scream at me. I get to the library doors and watch her. She was now standing at the edge of the parking lot. A car then pulls up next to her. The man who was driving was obviously upset with the woman. They were arguing, but I couldn't hear them from where I was. Eventually, she gets into the car and leaves with him. The next day I was dreading class because I didn't know what this woman's attitude would be the next day. But she wasn't there. In fact, she never came back to class. Looking back, I'm fairly certain that she wasn't even a student there, and for whatever reason, she was trying to lure me away. I wish I knew what her intentions were, but at the same time, I'm glad that I never had to find out. This happened when I was attending university, when I was 18 years old. I made an effort to make a lot of friends after I moved onto campus, and ended up with a few groups to hang out with. I even had a girlfriend. Students would usually have lunch in the cafeteria in pairs, 3 at the most, and I wasn't very picky about who I had lunch with, because like most people in class, we were all trying to make an effort to be social. A girl named Lily asked me if I wanted to eat lunch together after class. I didn't have any reservations about it. We made small talk about school and whatnot. After that day, she kept asking me to get lunch with her. It became a pattern, and there wasn't exactly a way to start saying no. At the time, I didn't mind, but this did mean I lost the chance to eat lunch with my other friends. In hindsight, I suppose that was the point. One day after class, somebody asked me if I could add them on social media. It was kind of a new thing back in those days. This happened right in front of Lily. I saw her face jerk toward me from a few seats over. It was such a sharp reaction that it was hard for me to ignore. By the time I got home later that day, Lily had sent me a friend request. We had no friends in common, and I don't know how she knew my last name. I was a bit surprised, but I guess she had just dug through the university's social media pages and found me there. It gave me a strange feeling, but what's the worst that could happen? She ended up messaging me non-stop and commenting on everything that I posted. I told myself that she was just socially awkward, but whatever. I've known worse people, or so I thought. She still always got me to eat lunch with her. Other than that, we rarely spent time together in person. I saw her around sometimes, but I never went out of my way to go hang out with her, so it was mostly online messaging and seeing each other at lunch. Coincidentally, my girlfriend was also named Lily. This was something that clearly bothered the other Lily. She occasionally hinted that she wanted my girlfriend to pick a different name, or joked about her name not suiting her. She obviously didn't like my girlfriend at all, and I had an idea of why. It was hard to ignore by this point. Lily was starting to subtly hint that she had a crush on me. I tried not to address it because what was I going to say? I've never known what to do when a friend makes a pass at me. I was also not interested in dating her at all. Even ignoring the weird stuff she pulled, Lily was just not my type. She tended to dress and act like a 1950s housewife and one of those adults who is still obsessed with Disney princesses, if you can imagine that. Things took an uncomfortable twist on the day of our last shared class of the year. Instead of asking me out to lunch, like she usually did, Lily asked me if I could go walk with her. Again, I didn't know how to refuse. Our campus was bordered by a large patch of woodland. Lily led me into the woods. The sounds of our fellow students slowly faded away. She sat down on a log, and I reluctantly joined her. She began talking about how she was going to miss me over the summer. I tried my best to placate her, but honestly, I didn't want to be there, especially because she seemed to be on the verge of tears. I think I tried to make an excuse about having plans with my girlfriend, but before I could leave, Lily kissed me without warning. It was uncomfortable, to say the least. I got out of there, and I was happy to think that I wouldn't be seeing her for a while. I came back to university after the summer break. I had moved into a house with some of my friends. Without getting too much off topic, there were some serious issues with this group of friends. There was a lot of petty arguing going on, and worse. I also broke up with my girlfriend around the start of the school year, and basically, this entire mess made me recontextualize things with Lily, because it suddenly didn't seem like a bad idea to socialize with her. With that said, I still did not want to be alone with her. We mostly talked online. It was around this time that I began dating a guy. Lily was not pleased to hear about that news. I think she hoped to sneak in after I broke up with my girlfriend. But as I said before, that was never going to happen. There wasn't a big gap between my breakup and this new relationship, so she must have thought that she missed her chance to be with me. This is where the story gets bad. At the time, I was fairly active on Tumblr. I would occasionally talk about my life, and mostly reblogged photos and stuff. I was on there one day when something odd happened. One of the blogs I followed messaged me. I saw a screenshot of somebody asking this completely random person to analyze my about section, and then asked their opinion on the type of person who would write it. I cannot stress to you how bizarre and completely out of left field it was to see someone trying to study me like a character in a book. The reply was basically, I don't know, sorry. But the important thing was that the question hadn't been anonymous. Obviously, I wanted to know who had taken such a bizarre interest in me. No prizes for guessing who was behind it. What I discovered was like a shrine. It was a cutesy pink and red page. There were a few posts about Lily's interests, but most of the content was focused on me. Most of the blogs were about me, chronicling things I had done recently, as well as references to things from as far back as I had known Lily. It was clear that she had been keeping tabs on me, both online and offline, gathering up every scrap of information she could about my life and filing it away in her collection. She talked about us eating lunch together and how special our dates were, as if it was something more than just acquaintances getting food after class. She talked about the time that she kissed me in the woods, but she made it sound like it was mutual. She quoted lyrics from my favorite songs and talked about how she would always be there for me, no matter who else came into my life. Lots of references to loving me just the way I am. things got worse. There were a lot of posts about my boyfriend. These were clearly psychotic. They talked about how he didn't deserve me, and he didn't know what he had, and that if she was with me, she would be jealous of anyone else who came near me. I don't like thinking about what kind of person would write so obsessively about their fixation on me. One thing that didn't make sense initially was that the blog also referenced Lily's best friend, Steven. She had never mentioned this person to me before. Her post talked about how Steven was such a great friend and how they had so much fun together and he would always look out for her, etc. I was trying to work out if this Steven was an online friend when one specific post made it all click. Steven sent this to me. He knew that I would love it. The problem was, the photo was taken from my own page. She was claiming that this fictional best friend of hers shared it with her. So in her messed up fantasy life, she split me into two people. I was both the perfect best friend who was always looking out for her, and her soulmate who was bound to end up with her when I finally got over my boyfriend and all these other easy girls I hung out with. Believe it or not, Lily had an audience. She asked open questions about me in regards to her relationship with me and got comments from her followers, people who took what she said at face value. I saw a bunch of random people agreeing with her and enabling her stalking behavior. Lily had constructed this fake, intricate fanfiction version of my life for anyone to share their opinion on, and she made herself out to be the hero. I went maybe a month back into this page's history. I did not look at everything that was there. Frankly, it made me sick. I'm not sure how long this had been going on for. I messaged Lily and confronted her about her f***ed-up little stalker shrine, and she said nothing. I cannot stress to you how weird it was to have found pages and pages dedicated to me, with her talking about how she was in love with me and would make sure that we ended up together, creating this messed up fantasy with two different versions of me in it. And when I confronted her, she acted like it never happened. She eventually deleted the page, or at least changed the name so that I couldn't find it. No way was I ever going to hang out with her again, but we still shared a class, and she was starting to scare me with what she might do next. I'm a paranoid person by nature, so knowing that someone was obsessively keeping track of me for who knows how long freaked me out. The next thing she pulled was trying to seduce my boyfriend. It was an absolutely useless attempt that only made him feel awkward. He told me about it right away. What was her plan there? Did she hope that he would cheat on me with her and then wait for me to break up with him? When that dumpster fire of a plan failed, she tried hitting on 3 of my other friends. None of them took the bait. She ended up dating one of my former roommates for a while, but made sure to send me messages while they were together, letting me know that she would rather be with me. Bleh. No thanks. Lily made sure to stay in my life the entire time I was at that university. There was a time when I tried to pull away from her, and that's when she started rumors about me, which damaged career opportunities that I had put a lot of work into. I don't know what else she did behind my back, but it made me realize it was safer to let her think that she was part of my life rather than doing something that would cause her to get angry. After I graduated, Lily was still trying to claw her way back into my life. I almost stopped posting on social media entirely by this point. Of course, she didn't give up that easily. She tried to start conversations. I usually just ignored her. I didn't like to think how she was still tracking me online. The last time we had a real conversation was when she messaged me out of nowhere, and thinking about what transpired makes my skin crawl. but I'll summarize what happened. She started asking me very personal questions about my sexuality. I really didn't want to talk about that with her, but I told her some basic stuff. Then she changed the subject and began talking about how would I feel if she was a boy. There was something seriously wrong with this girl. I tried telling her not to pull this crap with me, but she responded by sending photos of herself, followed by a bunch of messages, maybe 4 or 5 a minute, way too fast for me to reply before the next one arrived, basically quoting back what I had told her about myself as if she was role-playing as me, trying to absorb my history like some kind of parasite. I cut off all communication with her after that. I eventually deleted her from all of my social media pages, which was the only real way she had of contacting me now. I really thought that she might have finally moved on, but only a few days ago, she sent me another friend request. It's sitting there unanswered, because I know that if I delete it, she'll only send another one. For some perspective, Lily and I first met nearly 12 years ago. This story here is just the highlights, and even then, it's only the stuff that I know about.